Book 9, Part 1 of History of the Kings of Britain by Geoffrey of Monmouth. Translated by Aaron Thompson and J. A. Giles. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 1. Arthur succeeds Uther, his father, in the kingdom of Britain, and besieges Colgryn. Uther Pendragon being dead, the nobility from several provinces assembled together at Silchester, and proposed to Dubricius, Archbishop of Legions, that he should consecrate Arthur, Uther's son, to be their king. For they were now in great straits, because, upon hearing of the king's death, the Saxons had invited over their countrymen from Germany, and, under the command of Colgryn, were attempting to exterminate the whole British race. They had also entirely subdued all that part of the island which extends from the Humber to the Sea of Caithness. Dubricius, therefore, grieving for the calamities of his country, in conjunction with the other bishops, set the crown upon Arthur's head. Arthur was then 15 years old, but a youth of such unparalleled courage and generosity, joined with that sweetness of temper and innate goodness, as gained him universal love. When his coronation was over, he, according to usual custom, showed his bounty and munificence to the people. And such a number of soldiers flocked to him upon it, that his treasury was not able to answer that vast expense. But such a spirit of generosity, joined with valour, can never long want means to support itself. Arthur, therefore, the better to keep up his munificence, resolved to make use of his courage, and fall upon the Saxons, that he might enrich his followers with their wealth. To this he was also moved by the justice of the cause, since the entire monarchy of Britain belonged to him by hereditary right. Hereupon, assembling the youth under his command, he marched to York, of which, when Colgryn had intelligence, he met him with a very great army, composed of Saxons, Scots, and Picts, by the river Douglas, where a battle happened, with the loss of the greater part of both armies. Notwithstanding, the victory fell to Arthur, who pursued Colgryn to York, and there besieged him. Badulf, upon the news of his brother's flight, went towards the siege with a body of 6,000 men to his relief, for at the time of the battle he was upon the sea-coast, waiting the arrival of Duke Cheldric with succours from Germany, and being now no more than 10 miles distant from the city, his purpose was to make a speedy march in the night-time and fall upon the enemy by way of surprise. But Arthur, having intelligence of his design, sent a detachment of 600 horse and 3,000 foot under the command of Cadwallo, Duke of Cornwall, to meet him the same night. Cadwallo, therefore, falling into the same road along which the enemy was passing, made a sudden assault upon them, and entirely defeated the Saxons and put them to flight. Badulf was excessively grieved at this disappointment in the relief which he intended for his brother, and began to think of some other stratagem to gain access to him, in which, if he could but succeed, he thought they might concert measures together for their safety. And since he had no other way for it, he shaved his head and beard, and put on the habit of a jester with a harp, and in this disguise walked up and down the camp, playing upon his instrument as if he had been a harper. He thus passed unsuspected, and by a little and little went up to the walls of the city, where he was at last discovered by the besieged, who thereupon drew him up with cords, and conducted him to his brother. At this unexpected, though much desired meeting, they spent some time in joyfully embracing each other, and then began to consider various stratagems for their delivery. At last, just as they were considering their case desperate, the ambassadors returned from Germany, and brought with them to Albania a fleet of 600 sail, laden with brave soldiers, under the command of Cheldric. Upon this news, Arthur was dissuaded by his council from continuing the siege any longer, for fear of hazarding a battle with so powerful and numerous an enemy. Chapter 2. Hurl sent 15,000 men to Arthur's assistance. Arthur complied with their advice, and made his retreat to London, where he called an assembly of all the clergy and nobility of the kingdom to ask their advice what course to take against the formidable power of the pagans. After some deliberation, it was agreed that ambassadors should be dispatched into Armorica to King Hurl, to represent to him the calamitous state of Britain. Hurl was the son of Arthur's sister by Dubricius, king of the Armorican Britons, so that, upon advice of the disturbances his uncle was threatened with, he ordered his fleet to be got ready, and having assembled 15,000 men, he arrived with the first fair wind at Hamo's port, and was received with all suitable honour by Arthur, and most affectionately embraced by him. Chapter 3. Arthur makes the Saxons his tributaries. After a few days, they went to relieve the city Caerleadcoit that was besieged by the pagans, which, being situated upon a mountain between two rivers in the province of Lindisia, is called by another name, Lindocolinium. As soon as they arrived there with all their forces, they fought with the Saxons, and made a grievous slaughter of them to the number of 6,000, part of whom were drowned in the rivers, part fell by the hand of the Britons. The rest, in a great consternation, quitted the siege and fled, but were closely pursued by Arthur, till they came to the wood of Caledon, where they endeavoured to form themselves into a body again and make a stand. And here they again joined battle with the Britons, and made a brave defence, whilst the trees that were in the place secured them against the enemy's arrows. Arthur, seeing this, commanded that the trees that were in that part of the wood to be cut down, and the trunks to be placed quite round them, so as to hinder their getting out, resolving to keep them pent up here till he could reduce them by famine. He then commanded his troops to besiege the wood, and continued 3 days in that place. The Saxons, having now no provisions to sustain them, and being just ready to starve with hunger, begged for leave to go out, in consideration whereof they offered to leave all their gold and silver behind them, and return back to Germany with nothing but their empty ships. They promised also that they would pay him tribute from Germany and leave hostages with him. Arthur, after consultation about it, granted their petition, allowing them only leave to depart, and retaining all their treasures, as also hostages for payment of the tribute. But as they were under sail on their return home, they repented of their bargain, and tacked about again towards Britain, and went on shore at Totnes. No sooner were they landed than they made an utter devastation of the country, as far as the Severn Sea, and put all the peasants to the sword. From thence they pursued their furious march to the town of Bath, and laid siege to it. When the king had intelligence of it, he was beyond measure surprised at their proceedings, and immediately gave orders for the execution of the hostages, and desisting from an attempt which he had entered upon to reduce the Scots and Picts, he marched with the utmost expedition to raise the siege, but laboured under very great difficulties, because he had left his nephew Earl sick at Aclad. At length, having entered the province of Somerset, and beheld how the siege was carried on, he addressed himself to his followers in these words: "Since these impious and detestable Saxons have disdained to keep faith with me, I, to keep faith with God, will endeavour to revenge the blood of my countrymen this day upon them. To arms, soldiers, to arms, and courageously fall upon the perfidious wretches over whom we shall, with Christ assisting us, undoubtedly obtain the victory." Chapter 4. Dubricius's speech against the treacherous Saxons. Arthur with his own hand kills 470 Saxons in one battle. Colgrin and Badulf are killed in the same. When he had done speaking, St. Dubricius, Archbishop of Legions, going to the top of a hill, cried out with a loud voice, "You that have honour to profess the Christian faith, keep fixed in your minds the love which you owe to your country and fellow subjects, whose sufferings by the treachery of the pagans will be an everlasting reproach to you if you do not courageously defend them. It is your country which you fight for, and for which you should, when required, voluntarily suffer death, for that itself is a victory, and the cure of the soul. For he that shall die for his brethren offers himself a living sacrifice to God, and has Christ for his example, who condescended to lay down his life for his brethren. If, therefore, any of you shall be killed in this war, that death itself, which is suffered in so glorious a cause, shall be to him for penance and absolution of all his sins." At these words, all of them, encouraged with the benediction of the holy prelate, instantly armed themselves and prepared to obey his orders. Also Arthur himself, having put on a coat of mail suitable to the grandeur of so powerful a king, placed a golden helmet upon his head, on which was engraven the figure of a dragon, and on his shoulders his shield called Priwen, upon which, the picture of the Blessed Mary, Mother of God, was painted, in order to put him frequently in mind of her. Then girding on his caliburn, which was an excellent sword made in the Isle of Avalon, he graced his right hand with his lance, named Ron, which was hard, broad, and fit for slaughter. After this, having placed his men in order, he boldly attacked the Saxons, who were drawn out in the shape of a wedge, as their manner was. And they, notwithstanding that the Britons fought with great eagerness, made a noble defence all that day, but at length, towards sunsetting, climbed up to the next mountain, which served them for a camp. For they desired no larger extent of ground, since they confided very much in their numbers. The next morning Arthur, with his army, went up the mountain, but lost many of his men in the ascent, by the advantage which the Saxons had in their station on the top, from whence they could pour down upon him with much greater speed than he was able to advance against them. Notwithstanding, after a very hard struggle, the Britons gained the summit of the hill and quickly came to a close engagement with the enemy, who again gave them a warm reception and made a very vigorous defence. In this manner was a great part of that day also spent, whereupon Arthur, provoked to see the little advantage he had yet gained, and that victory still continued in suspense, drew out his caliburn, and calling upon the name of the Blessed Virgin, rushed forward with great fury into the thickest of the enemy's ranks, of whom, such was the merit of his prayers, not one escaped alive that felt the fury of his sword. Neither did he give over the fury of the assault, until he had with his caliburn alone killed 470 men. The Britons, seeing this, followed their leader in great multitudes, and made slaughter on all sides, so that Colgrin and Baldulf his brother, and many thousands more, fell before them. But Cheldric, in this imminent danger of his men, betook himself to flight. Chapter 5. The Saxons, after their leader Cheldric was killed, are all compelled by Cador to surrender. The victory being thus gained, the king commanded Cador, Duke of Cornwall, to pursue them, while he himself should hasten his march into Albania, from whence he had advice that the Scots and the Picts were besieging Alclad, in which, as we have said before, Hurl lay sick. Therefore he hastened to his assistance, for fear he might fall into the hands of the barbarians. In the meantime, the Duke of Cornwall, who had the command of 10,000 men, would not as yet pursue the Saxons in their flight, but speedily made himself master of their ships, to hinder their getting on board, and manned them with his best soldiers, who were to beat back the pagans in case they should flee thither. After this, he hastily pursued the enemy, according to Arthur's command, and allowed no quarter to those he could overtake, so that they whose behaviour before was so cruel and insolent, now with timorous hearts fled for shelter, sometimes to the coverts of the woods, sometimes to mountains and caves, to prolong a wretched life. At last, when none of these places could afford them a safe retreat, they entered the Isle of Thanet with their broken forces, but neither did they there get free of the Duke of Cornwall's pursuit, for he still continued slaughtering them, and gave them no respite till he had killed Cheldric and taken hostages for the surrender of the rest. Chapter 6. Arthur grants a pardon to the Scots and Picts besieged at the Lake Lomond. Having therefore settled peace here, he redirected his march to Alclad, which Arthur had relieved from the oppression of barbarians, and from thence conducted his army to Muraif, where the Scots and Picts were besieged. After 3 several battles with the king and his nephew, they had fled as far as this province, and entering upon the Lake Lomond, sought for refuge in the islands that are upon it. This lake contains 60 islands, and receives 60 rivers into it, which empty themselves into the sea by no more than one mouth. There is also an equal number of rocks in these islands, as also of eagles' nests in those rocks, which flocked together there every year, and, by the loud and general noise which they now made, foreboded some remarkable event that should happen to the kingdom. To these islands, therefore, had the enemy fled, thinking the lake would serve them instead of a fortification, but it proved of little advantage to them, for Arthur, having got together a fleet, sailed round the rivers and besieged the enemy 15 days together, by which they were so straitened with hunger that they died by thousands. While he was harassing them in this manner, Guillemarius, king of Ireland, came up in a fleet with a very great army of barbarians, in order to relieve the besieged. This obliged Arthur to raise the siege, and turn his arms against the Irish, whom he slew without mercy, and compelled the rest to return back to their country. After this victory, he proceeded in his first attempt, which was to extirpate the whole race of the Scots and Picts, and treated them with an unparalleled severity. And as he allowed quarter to none, the bishops of that miserable country, with all the inferior clergy, met together, and bearing the relics of the saints and other consecrated things of the church before them, barefooted, came to implore the king's mercy for their people. As soon as they were admitted into his presence, they fell down upon their knees, and humbly besought him to have pity upon their distressed country, since the sufferings which he had already made it undergo were sufficient, nor was there any necessity to cut off the small remainder to a man, and that he would allow them the enjoyment of a small part of the country, since they were willing to bear the yoke which he would impose upon them. The king was moved at the manner of their delivering this petition, and could not forbear expressing his clemency to them with tears, and at the request of those holy men granted them pardon. Chapter 7. Arthur relates the wonderful nature of some ponds. This affair being concluded, Hurl had the curiosity to view the situation of the lake, and wondered to find the number of rivers, islands, rocks, and eagles' nests so exactly correspond. And while he was reflecting upon it as something that appeared miraculous, Arthur came to him and told him of yet another pond in the same province, which was yet more wonderful. For not far from thence was one whose length and breadth were each 20 feet, and depth 5 feet. But whether its square figure was natural or artificial, the wonder of it was there were 4 different sorts of fishes in the 4 several corners of it, none of which were ever found in any other part of the pond but their own. He told him likewise of another pond in Wales, near the Severn, called by the country people Lindigwan, into which, when the sea flows, it receives it in the manner of a gulf, but so as to swallow up the tide and never be filled, or have its banks covered by it. But at the ebbing of the sea, it throws out the waters which it had swallowed, as high as a mountain, and at last dashes and covers the banks with them. In the meantime, if all the people of that country should stand near with their faces towards it, and happen to have their clothes sprinkled with the dashing of the waves, they would hardly, if at all, escape being swallowed up by the pond. But with their backs towards it, they need not fear being dashed, though they stood upon the very banks. Chapter 8. Arthur restores York to its ancient beauty, especially as to the churches. The king, after his general pardon granted to the Scots, went to York to celebrate the feast of Christ's Nativity, which was now at hand. On entering the city, he beheld with grief the desolation of the churches, for upon the expulsion of the holy Archbishop Saxo and of all the clergy there, the temples which were half burnt down had no longer divine service performed in them, so much had the impious rage of the pagans prevailed. After this, in an assembly of the clergy and people, he appointed Pyramus his chaplain, metropolitan of that see. The churches that lay level with the ground he rebuilt, and, which was their chief ornament, saw them filled with assemblies of devout persons of both sexes. Also, the nobility that were driven out by the disturbances of the Saxons he restored to their country. Chapter 9. Arthur honours Orgusel with the sceptre of the Scots, Urian with that of Merif, and Lot with the consulship of Londonesia. There were there 3 brothers of royal blood, viz. Lot, Urian, and Orgusel, who, before the Saxons had prevailed, held the government of those parts. Being willing, therefore, to bestow on these, as he did on others, the rights of their ancestors, he restored to Orgusel the sovereignty over the Scots. His brother Urian he honoured with the sceptre of Merif, and Lot, who in the time of Aurelius Ambrosius had married his sister, by whom he had 2 sons, Walgon and Mordred, he re-established in the consulship of Londonesia and the other provinces belonging to him. At length, when the whole country was reduced by him to its ancient state, he took to wife Guanhumara, descended from a noble family of Romans, who was educated under Duke Cador, and in beauty surpassed all the women of the island. Chapter 10. Arthur adds to his government Ireland, Iceland, Gothland, and the Orkneys. The next summer he fitted out a fleet and made an expedition into Ireland, which he was desirous to reduce. Upon landing there, he was met by King Guillemurius before mentioned, with a vast number of men, who came with a design to fight him. But at the very beginning of the battle, those naked and unarmed people were miserably routed and fled to such places as lay open to them for shelter. Guillemurius also in a short time was taken prisoner and forced to submit, as were also all the other princes of the country after the king's example, being under great consternation at what had happened. After an entire conquest of Ireland, he made a voyage with his fleet to Iceland, which he also subdued. And now a rumour spreading over the rest of the islands that no country was able to withstand him. Daldavius, king of Gothland, and Gunfucius, king of the Orkneys, came voluntarily and made their submission on a promise of paying tribute. Then, as soon as winter was over, he returned back to Britain, where, having established the kingdom, he resided in it for 12 years together in peace. End of Book 9, Part 1. Book 9, Part 2 of History of the Kings of Britain by Geoffrey of Monmouth. Translated by Aaron Thompson and J. A. Giles. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 11. Arthur subdues Norway, Dacia, Aquitaine, and Gaul. After this, having invited over to him all persons whatsoever that were famous for valour in foreign nations, he began to augment the number of his domestics, and introduced such politeness into his court as people of the remotest countries thought worthy of their imitation, so that there was not a nobleman who thought himself of any consideration, unless his clothes and arms were made in the same fashion as those of Arthur's knights. At length, the fame of his munificence and valour spreading over the whole world, he became a terror to the kings of other countries, who grievously feared the loss of their dominion if he should make any attempt upon them. Being much perplexed with these anxious cares, they repaired their cities and towers, and built towns in convenient places, the better to fortify themselves against any enterprise of Arthur, when occasion should require. Arthur, being informed of what they were doing, was delighted to find how much they stood in awe of him, and formed a design for the conquest of all Europe. Then, having prepared his fleet, he first attempted Norway, that he might procure the crown of it for Lot, his sister's husband. This Lot was the nephew of Cymbeline, king of the Norwegians, who being then dead, had appointed him his successor in the kingdom. But the Norwegians, disdaining to receive him, had advanced one Riculf to the sovereignty, and having fortified their cities, thought they were able to oppose Arthur. Walgan, the son of Lot, was then a youth, 12 years old, and was recommended by his uncle to the service of Pope Sulpicius, from whom he received arms. But to return to the history, as soon as Arthur arrived on the coast of Norway, King Riculf, attended with the whole power of that kingdom, met him and gave him battle, in which, after a great loss of blood on both sides, the Britons at length had the advantage, and making a vigorous charge, killed Riculf and many others with him. Having thus defeated them, they set the cities on fire, dispersed the country people, and pursued the victory till they had reduced all Norway, as also Dacia, under the dominion of Arthur. After the conquest of these countries, and establishment of Lot upon the throne of Norway, Arthur made a voyage to Gaul, and dividing his army into several bodies, began to lay waste that country on all sides. The province of Gaul was then committed to Floro, a Roman tribune, who held the government of it under the Emperor Leo. Upon intelligence of Arthur's coming, he raised all the forces that were under his command, and made war against him, but without success. For Arthur was attended with the youth of all the islands that he had subdued, for which reason he was reported to have such an army as was thought invincible. And even the greater part of the Gallic army, encouraged by his bounty, came over to his service. Therefore Floro, seeing the disadvantages he lay under, left his camp and fled with a small number to Paris. There, having recruited his army, he fortified the city and resolved to stand another engagement with Arthur. But while he was thinking of strengthening himself with military forces in the neighbouring countries, Arthur came upon him unawares and besieged him in the city. When a month had passed, Floro, with grief observing his people perish with hunger, sent a message to Arthur that they two alone should decide the contest for the kingdom in a duel. For being a person of great stature, boldness, and courage, he gave this challenge in confidence of success. Arthur was extremely pleased at Floro's proposal, and sent him word back again that he would give him the meeting which he desired. A treaty, therefore, being on both sides agreed to, they met together in the island without the city, where the people waited to see the event. They were both gracefully armed and mounted on admirably swift horses, and it was hard to tell which gave greater hopes of victory. When they had presented themselves against each other with their lances aloft, they put spurs to their horses and began a fierce encounter. But Arthur, who handled his lance more warily, struck it into the upper part of Floro's breast, and avoiding his enemy's weapon, laid him prostrate upon the ground, and was just going to dispatch him with his drawn sword. But Floro, starting up on a sudden, met him with his lance couched, wherewith he mortally stabbed the breast of Arthur's horse, and caused both him and his rider to fall. The Britons, when they saw their king lying on the ground, fearing he was killed, could hardly be restrained from breach of covenant, and falling with one consent upon the Gauls. But just as they were upon rushing into the lists, Arthur hastily got up, and guarding himself with his shield, advanced with speed against Floro. And now they renewed the assault with such rage, eagerly bent upon one another's destruction. At length Floro, watching his advantage, gave Arthur a blow upon the forehead, which might have proved mortal had he not blunted the edge of his weapon against the helmet. When Arthur saw his coat of mail and shield red with blood, he was inflamed with still greater rage, and lifting up his caliburn with his utmost strength, struck it through the helmet into Floro's head, and made a terrible gash. With this wound Floro fell down, tearing the ground with his spurs, and expired. As soon as this news was spread through the army, the citizens ran together, and opening the gates, surrendered the city to Arthur. After the victory, he divided his army into two parts, one of which he committed to the conduct of Hurl, whom he ordered to march against Guitard, commander of the Pictavians, while he with the other part should endeavour to reduce the other provinces. Hurl, upon this, entered Aquitaine, possessed himself of the cities of that country, and after distressing Guithard in several battles, forced him to surrender. He also destroyed Gascony with fire and sword, and subdued the princes of it. At the end of 9 years, in which time all the parts of Gaul were entirely reduced, Arthur returned back to Paris, where he kept his court, and calling an assembly of the clergy and people, established peace and the just administration of the laws in that kingdom. Then he bestowed Neustria, now called Normandy, upon Bedver, his butler, the province of Andagavia upon Caius, his sewer, and several other provinces upon his great men that attended him. Then, having settled the peace of the cities and countries there, he returned back in the beginning of spring to Britain. Chapter 12. Arthur summons a great many kings, princes, archbishops, etc., to a solemn assembly at the City of Legions. Upon the approach of the feast of Pentecost, Arthur, the better to demonstrate his joy after such triumphant success, and for the more solemn observation of that festival, and reconciling the minds of the princes that were now subject to him, resolved, during that season, to hold a magnificent court, to place the crown upon his head, and to invite all the kings and dukes under his subjection to the solemnity. And when he had communicated his design to his familiar friends, he pitched upon the City of Legions as a proper place for his purpose. For besides its great wealth above the other cities, its situation, which was in Glamorganshire upon the river Usk, near the Severn Sea, was most pleasant and fit for so great a solemnity. For on one side it was washed by that noble river, so that the kings and princes from the countries beyond the seas might have the convenience of sailing up to it. On the other side, the beauty of the meadows and groves, and magnificence of the royal palaces, with lofty gilded roofs that adorned it, made it even rival the grandeur of Rome. It was also famous for 2 churches, whereof one was built in honour of the martyr Julius, and adorned with a choir of virgins who had devoted themselves wholly to the service of God. But the other, which was founded in memory of St. Aaron, his companion, and maintained a convent of canons, was the 3rd metropolitan church of Britain. Besides, there was a college of 200 philosophers who, being learned in astronomy and the other arts, were diligent in observing the courses of the stars, and gave Arthur true predictions of the events that would happen at that time. In this place, therefore, which afforded such delights, were preparations made for the ensuing festival. Ambassadors were then sent into several kingdoms to invite to court the princes both of Gaul and all the adjacent islands. Accordingly, there came Orgusel, king of Albania, now Scotland, Urien, king of Murif, Cadwallo, king of the Venedocians, now called the North Walesmen, Sater, king of the Domitians, or South Walesmen, Cador, king of Cornwall, also the archbishops of the 3 metropolitan sees, London, York, and Dubricius of the City of Legions. This prelate, who was primate of Britain and legate of the Apostolic See, was so eminent for his piety that he could cure any sick person by his prayers. There came also the consuls of the principal cities, viz., Morvid, consul of Gloucester, Mauron of Worcester, Anarout of Salisbury, Arthgal of Cargwit or Wargwit, Jugin of Leicester, Cursalan of Caicester, Kinmare, Duke of Dorburnia, Galloc of Salisbury, Eugenius of Bath, Jonathal of Dorchester, Boso of Ridoc, that is Oxford. Besides the consuls came the following worthies of no less dignity: Danout map Papo, Cheneas map Coil, Peredur map Erida, Guiful map Norgait, Regin map Clant, Edelin map Edelauk, Kinkar map Bagan, Kimare Guberanian map Goit, Clofout Rupmanaton, Cymbeline map Trunout, Cathleas map Catel, Kinlich map Nathan, and many others too tedious to enumerate. From the adjacent islands came Guillemarius, king of Ireland, Malvasius, king of Iceland, Doldavius, king of Gothland, Gunphasius, king of the Orkneys, Lot, king of Norway, Achilles, king of the Dacians. From the parts beyond the seas came Haldin, king of Rutini, Leodegarius, consul of Bologna, Bedford, the butler, duke of Normandy, Borellius, king of Cenomania, Caius the sewer, duke of Andegavia, Guitard of Pictavia, also the 12 peers of Gaul, whom Guerinus Carnatensis brought along with him, Hurl, duke of the Armorican Britons, and his nobility, who came with such a train of mules, horses, and rich furniture as it is difficult to describe. Besides these, there remained no prince of any consideration on this side of Spain who came not upon this invitation. And no wonder, when Arthur's munificence, which was celebrated over the whole world, made him beloved by all the people. Chapter 13. A description of the royal pomp at the coronation of Arthur. When all were assembled together in the city upon the day of the solemnity, the archbishops were conducted to the palace in order to place the crown upon the king's head. Therefore Dubricius, inasmuch as the court was kept in his diocese, made himself ready to celebrate the office, and undertook the ordering of whatever related to it. As soon as the king was invested with his royal habiliments, he was conducted in great pomp to the metropolitan church, supported on each side by 2 archbishops, and having 4 kings, viz. Of Albania, Cornwall, Demetia, and Venedotia, whose right it was, bearing 4 golden swords before him. He was also attended with a concert of all sorts of music, which made most excellent harmony. On another part was the queen, dressed out in her richest ornaments, conducted by the archbishops and bishops to the temple of virgins. The 4 queens also of the kings last mentioned, bearing before her 4 white doves, according to ancient custom. And after her there followed a retinue of women, making all imaginable demonstrations of joy. When the whole procession was ended, so transporting was the melody of the musical instruments and voices, whereof there was a vast variety in both churches, that the knights who attended were in doubt which to prefer, and therefore crowded from the one to the other by turns, and were far from being tired with the solemnity, though the whole day had been spent in it. At last, when divine service was over at both churches, the king and queen put off their crowns, and putting on their lighter ornaments, went to the banquet, he to one palace with the men, and she to another with the women. For the Britons still observed the ancient custom of Troy, by which the men and the women used to celebrate their festivals apart. When they had all taken their seats according to precedence, Caius the sewer, in rich robes of ermine, with 1,000 young noblemen, all in like manner clothed in ermine, served up the dishes. From another part, Bedford the butler was followed with the same number of attendants, in various habits, who waited with all kinds of cups and drinking vessels. In the Queen's palace were innumerable waiters, dressed with a variety of ornaments, all performing their respective offices, which, if I should describe particularly, I should draw out the history to a tedious length. For at that time Britain had arrived at such a pitch of grandeur, that in abundance of riches, luxury of ornaments, and politeness of inhabitants, it far surpassed all other kingdoms. The knights in it, that were famous for their feats of chivalry, wore their clothes and arms all of the same colour and fashion, and the women also, no less celebrated for their wit, wore all the same kind of apparel, and esteemed none worthy of their love but such as had given a proof of their valour in 3 several battles. Thus was the valour of the men an encouragement for the women's chastity, and the love of the women a spur to the soldiers' bravery. Chapter 14. After a variety of sports at the coronation, Arthur amply rewards his servants. As soon as the banquets were over, they went into the fields without the city, to divert themselves with various sports. The military men composed a kind of diversion in imitation of a fight on horseback, and the ladies, placed on top of the walls as spectators, in a sportive manner, darted their amorous glances at the courtiers, the more to encourage them. Others spent the remainder of the day in other diversions, such as shooting with bows and arrows, tossing the pike, casting of heavy stones and rocks, playing at dice and the like, and all these inoffensively and without quarrelling. Whoever gained the victory in any of these sports was rewarded with a rich prize by Arthur. In this manner were the first 3 days spent, and on the 4th, all who, upon account of their titles, bore any kind of office at this solemnity, were called together to receive honours and preferments in reward of their services, and to fill up the vacancies in the governments of cities and castles, archbishoprics, bishoprics, abbeys, and other posts of honour. Chapter 15. A letter from Lucius Tiberius, general of the Romans, to Arthur being read, they consult about an answer to it. But sent to Britius, from a pious desire of leading a hermit's life, made a voluntary resignation of his archiepiscopal dignity, and in his room was consecrated David, the king's uncle, whose life was a perfect example of that goodness which, by his doctrine, he taught. In place of St. Sampson, Archbishop of Dole, was appointed, with the consent of Hurl, the king of the Armorican Britons, Trellianus, a famous priest of Llandaff, a person highly recommended for his good life and character. The bishopric of Silchester was conferred upon Marganius. that of Winchester upon Duanius, and that of Alclad upon Elidanius. While he was disposing of these preferments among them, it happened that 12 men of an advanced age and venerable aspect, and bearing olive branches in their right hands, for a token that they were come upon an embassy, appeared before the king, moving towards him with a slow pace, and speaking with a soft voice, and after their compliments paid, presented him with a letter from Lucius Tiberius in these words: Lucius, procurator of the Commonwealth, to Arthur, King of Britain, according to his desert. The insolence of your tyranny is what fills me with the highest admiration, and the injuries you have done to Rome still increase my wonder. But it is provoking to reflect that you are grown so much above yourself as wilfully to avoid seeing this. Nor do you consider what it is to have offended by unjust deeds a senate to whom you cannot be ignorant that the whole world owes vassalage. For the tribute of Britain, which the Senate had enjoined you to pay, and which used to be paid to the Roman emperors successively from the time of Julius Caesar, you have had the presumption to withhold in contempt of their imperial authority. You have seized upon the province of the Allobroge and all the islands of the ocean, whose kings, while the Roman power prevailed in these parts, paid tribute to our ancestors. And because the Senate have agreed to demand justice of you for such repeated injuries, I command you to appear at Rome before the middle of August the next year, there to make satisfaction to your masters, and undergo such sentence as they shall, in justice, pass upon you, which if you refuse to do, I shall come to you, and endeavour to recover with my sword what you, in your madness, have robbed us of. As soon as the letter was read in the presence of the kings and consuls, Arthur withdrew with them into the giant's tower, which was at the entrance to the palace, to think what answer was fit to be returned to such an insolent message. As they were going up the stairs, Cadwallo, Duke of Cornwall, who was a man of merry disposition, said to the king in jocose manner, I have been till now under fear, lest the easy life which the Britons lead, by enjoying a long peace, might make them cowards, and extinguish the fame of their gallantry, by which they have raised their name above all other nations. For where the exercise of arms is wanting, and the pleasures of women, dice, and other diversions take place, no doubt what remains of virtue, honour, courage, and thirst of praise will be tainted with the rust of idleness. For now almost 5 years have passed since we have been abandoned to these delights, and have had no exercise of war. Therefore, to deliver us from sloth, God has stirred up the spirit of the Romans to restore our military virtues to their ancient state. In this manner did he entertain them with discourse, till they were come to their seats, on which, when they were all placed, Arthur spoke to them after this manner. Chapter 16. Arthur, holding a council with the kings, desires every one of them to deliver their opinions.
My companions, both in good and bad fortune, whose abilities, both in council and war, I have hitherto experienced, the present exigence of affairs, after the message which we have received, requires your careful deliberation and prudent resolutions, for whatever is widely concerted is easily executed. Therefore we shall be the better able to bear the annoyance which Lucius threatens to give us, if we unanimously apply ourselves to consider how to overcome it. In my opinion, we have no great reason to fear him when we reflect upon the unjust pretence on which he demands tribute of us. He says he has a right to it, because it was paid to Julius Caesar and his successors, who invaded Britain with an army at the invitation of the ancient Britons, when they were quarrelling among themselves, and by force reduced the country under their power, when weakened by civil dissension. And because they gained it in this manner, they had the injustice to take tribute of it. For that can never be possessed justly which is gained by force and violence. So that he has no reasonable grounds to pretend we are of right his tributaries. But since he has the presumption to make an unjust demand of us, we have certainly as good reason to demand of him tribute from Rome. Let the longest sword, therefore, determine the right between us. For if Rome has decreed that tribute ought to be paid to it from Britain, on account of its being formerly under the yoke of Julius Caesar and other Roman emperors, I, for the same reason, now decree that Rome ought to pay tribute to me, because my predecessors formerly held the government of it. For Belinus, that glorious king of the Britons, with the assistance of his brother Brennus, Duke of the Allobroge, after they had hanged up 20 noble Romans in the middle of the marketplace, took their city and kept possession of it a long time. Likewise Constantine, the son of Helena, as also Maximian, who were both near of blood to me, and both wore the crown of Britain, gained the imperial throne of Rome. Do not you, therefore, think that we ought to demand tribute of the Romans? As for Gaul and the adjacent islands of the ocean, we have no occasion to return them any answer, since they did not defend them when we attempted to free them from their power. As soon as he had done speaking to this effect, Hurl, king of the Armorican Britons, who had the precedence of the rest, made an answer in these words. Chapter 17. The opinion of Hurl, king of Armorica, concerning a war with the Romans. After the most profound deliberation that any of us shall be able to make, I think better advice cannot be given than what your Majesty, in your great wisdom and policy, now offers. Your speech, which is no less wise than eloquent, has superseded all consultation on our part, and nothing remains for us to do but to admire and gratefully acknowledge your Majesty's firmness of mind and depth of policy, to which we owe such excellent advice. For if, upon this motive, you are pleased to make an expedition to Rome, I doubt not but it will be crowned with glorious success, since it will be undertaken for the defence of our liberties, and to demand justly of our enemies what they have unjustly demanded of us. For that person who would rob another deserves to lose his own by him against whom the attempt is made. And therefore, since the Romans threatened us with this injury, it will undoubtedly turn to their own loss if we can but have an opportunity of engaging with them. This is what the Britons universally desire. This is what we have promised us in the Cymbeline prophecies, which expressly declare that the Roman Empire shall be obtained by 3 persons native of Britain. The oracle is fulfilled in 2 of them, since it is manifest, as your Majesty observed, that those 2 celebrated princes, Belinus and Constantine, governed the Roman Empire. And now you are the 3rd to whom this supreme dignity is promised. Make haste, therefore, to receive what God makes no delay to give you, to subdue those who are ready to receive your yoke, and to advance us all who for your advancement will spare neither limbs nor life. And that you may accomplish this, I myself will attend you in person with 10,000 men. Chapter 18. The Opinion of Orgusal. When Hurl concluded his speech, Orgusal, king of Albania, declared his good affection to the cause after this manner. I am not able to express the joy that has transported me, since my lord has declared to us his designs. For we seem to have done nothing by all our past wars with so many impotent princes, if the Romans and Germans be suffered to enjoy peace, and we do not severely revenge on them the grievous oppressions which they formerly brought upon this country. But now, since we are at liberty to encounter them, I am overwhelmed with joy and eagerness of desire to see a battle with them, when the blood of those cruel oppressors will be no less acceptable to me than a spring of water is to one who is parched with thirst. If I shall but live to see that day, how sweet will be the wounds which I shall then either receive or give. Nay, how sweet shall be even death itself, when suffered in revenging the injuries done to our ancestors, in defending our liberties, and in promoting the glory of our king. Let us then begin with these poltroons, and spoil them all of their trophies, by making an entire conquest of them. And I, for my share, will add to the army 2,000 horse, besides foot. Chapter 19. They unanimously agree upon a war with the Romans. To the same effect spoke all the rest, and promised each of them their full quota of forces, so that besides those promised by the Duke of Armorica, the number of men from the island of Britain alone was 60,000, all completely armed. But the kings of the other islands, as they had not been accustomed to any cavalry, promised their quota of infantry, and from the 6 provincial islands, viz. Ireland, Iceland, Gothland, the Orkneys, Norway, and Dacia, were reckoned 120,000. From the duchies of Gaul, that is, of the Ruteni, the Portunians, the Estrusians, the Caenomani, the Angadavians, and the Pictavians, were 80,000. From the 12 consulships of those who came along with Quirinius Carnitensis, 1,200. Altogether, they made up 183,200, besides foot, which did not easily fall under number. Chapter 20. Arthur prepares for a war, and refuses to pay tribute to the Romans. King Arthur, seeing all unanimously ready for his service, ordered them to return back to their countries with speed and get ready the forces which they had promised, and to hasten to the general rendezvous upon the calends of August, at the mouth of the river Barber, that from thence they might advance with them to the borders of the Allobroge to meet the Romans. Then he sent word to the emperors by their ambassadors that as to paying them tribute, he would in no wise obey their commands, and that the journey he was about to make to Rome was not to stand the award of their sentence, but to demand of them what they had judicially decreed to demand of him. With this answer the ambassadors departed, and at the same time also departed all the kings and noblemen to perform with all expedition the orders that had been given them. End of Book 9, Part 2.
Book 10, Part 1 of History of the Kings of Britain by Geoffrey of Monmouth, translated by Aaron Thompson and J. A. Giles. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 1. Lucius Tiberius calls together the Eastern kings against the Britons. Lucius Tiberius, on receiving this answer, by order of the Senate, published a decree for the Eastern kings to come with their forces and assist in the conquest of Britain. In obedience to which, there came in a very short time Epistrophius, king of the Grecians, Mazumdar, king of the Africans, Elephantinum, king of Spain, Hirtatius, king of the Parthians, Bocchus of the Medes, Sertorius of Libya, Teucer, king of Phrygia, Xerxes, king of the Iturians, Pandrasus, king of Egypt, Micipsa, king of Babylon, Polytetes, duke of Bithynia, Teucer, duke of Phrygia, Evander of Syria, Aethon of Boeotia, Hippolytus of Crete, with the generals and nobility under them. Of the senatorian order also came Lucius Catellus, Marius Lepidus, Caius Metellus Cotta, Quintus Milvius Catullus, Quintus Carutius, and as many others as made up the number of 40,160. Chapter 2. Arthur commits to his nephew Mordred the government of Britain. His dream at Hamo's port. After the necessary dispositions were made, upon the calends of August they began their march towards Britain, which, when Arthur had intelligence of, he committed the government of the kingdom to his nephew Mordred and Queen Ganhumara, and marched with his army to Hamo's port, where the wind stood fair for him. But while he, surrounded with all his numerous fleet, was sailing joyfully with a brisk gale, it happened that about midnight he fell into a very sound sleep, and in a dream saw a bear flying in the air, at the noise of which all the shores trembled. Also a terrible dragon flying from the west, which enlightened the country with the brightness of its eyes. When these two met, they began a dreadful fight. But the dragon, with its fiery breath, burnt the bear, which often assaulted him, and threw him down scorched to the ground. Arthur, upon this awaking, related his dream to those that attended about him, who took it upon them to interpret it, and told him that the dragon signified himself. but the bear some giant that should encounter with him, and that the fight portended the duel that would be between them, and the dragon's victory the same that would happen to himself. But Arthur conjectured it portended something else, and that the vision was applicable to himself and the emperor. As soon as the morning after this night's sail appeared, they found themselves arrived at the mouth of the river Barber, and there they pitched their tents to wait the arrival of the kings of the islands and the generals of the other provinces. Chapter 3. Arthur kills a Spanish giant who had stolen away Helena, the niece of Hurl. In the meantime, Arthur had news brought him that a giant of monstrous size was come from the shores of Spain, and had forcibly taken away Helena, the niece of Duke Hurl, from her guard, and fled with her to the top of that which is now called Michael's Mount, and that the soldiers of the country who pursued him were able to do nothing against him. For whether they attacked him by sea or land, he either overturned their ships with vast rocks, or killed them with several sorts of darts, besides many of them that he took and devoured half alive. The next night, therefore, at the second hour, Arthur, taking along with him Caius the sewer and Bedford the butler, went out privately from the camp and hastened towards the mountain. For being a man of undaunted courage, he did not care to lead his army against such monsters, both because he could in this manner animate his men by his own example, and also because he was alone sufficient to deal with them. As soon as they came near the mountain, they saw a fire burning upon the top of it, and another on a lesser mountain that was not far from it. And being in doubt upon which of them the giant dwelt, they sent away Bedford to know the certainty of the matter. So he, finding a boat, sailed over in it first to the lesser mountain, to which he could in no other way have access, because it was situated in the sea. When he had begun to climb up to the top of it, he was at first frightened with a dismal howling cry of a woman from above, and imagined the monster to be there. But quickly rousing up his courage, he drew his sword, and having reached the top, found nothing but the fire which he had before seen at a distance. He discovered also a grave newly made, and an old woman weeping and howling by it, who at the sight of him instantly cried out in words interrupted with sighs, "O unhappy man! What misfortune brings you to this place? Oh, the inexpressible torture of death that you must suffer! I pity you, because the detestable monster will this night destroy the flower of your youth. For that most wicked and odious giant, who brought the Duke's niece, whom I have just now buried here, and me, her nurse, along with her into this mountain, will come and immediately murder you in a most cruel manner. O deplorable fate! This most illustrious princess, sinking under the fear her tender heart conceived, while the foul monster would have embraced her, fainted away and expired. And when he could not satiate his brutish lust upon her, who is the very soul, joy, and happiness of my life, being enraged at the disappointment of his bestial desire, he forcibly committed a rape upon me, who, let God and my old age witness, abhorred his embraces. Fly, dear sir, fly, for fear he may come, as he usually does, to lie with me, and finding you here, most barbarously butcher you." Bedver, moved at what she said, as much as it is possible for human nature to be, endeavoured with kind words to assuage her grief, and to comfort her with the promise of speedy help, and then returned back to Arthur and gave him an account of what he had met with. Arthur very much lamented the damsel's sad fate, and ordered his companions to leave him to deal with him alone, unless there was an absolute necessity, and then they were to come in boldly to his assistance. From hence they went directly to the next mountain, leaving their horses with their armour-bearers, and ascended to the top, Arthur leading the way. The deformed savage was then by the fire, with his face besmeared with the clotted blood of swine, part of which he had already devoured, and was roasting the remainder upon spits by the fire. But at the sight of them, whose appearance was a surprise to him, he hastened to his club, which 2 strong men could hardly lift from the ground. Upon this the king drew his sword, and guarding himself with his shield, ran with all his speed to prevent his getting it. But the other, who was not ignorant of his design, had by this time snatched it up, and gave the king such a terrible blow upon his shield that he made the shores ring with the noise, and perfectly stunned the king's ears with it. Arthur, fired with rage at this, lifted up his sword and gave him a wound in the forehead, which was not indeed mortal, but yet such as made the blood gush out over his face and eyes, and so blinded him, for he had partly warded off the stroke from his forehead with his club, and prevented it being fatal. However, his loss of sight, by reason of the blood flowing over his eyes, made him exert himself with an ever greater fury, and like an enraged boar against a hunting spear, so did he rush in against Arthur's sword, and grasping him about the waist, forced him down upon his knees. But Arthur, nothing daunted, slipped out of his hands, and so bestirred himself with his sword that he gave the giant no respite till he had struck it up to the very back through his skull. At this the hideous monster raised a dreadful roar, and, like an oak torn up from the roots by the winds, so did he make the ground resound with his fall. Arthur, bursting out into a fit of laughter at the sight, commanded Bedver to cut off his head and give it to one of the armour-bearers, who was to carry it to the camp and there expose it to public view, but with orders for the spectators of this combat to keep silence. He told them he had found none of so great strength since he had killed the giant Rithco, who had challenged him to fight upon the mountain Aravius. This giant had made himself furs from the beards of kings he had killed, and had sent word to Arthur carefully to flee off his beard and send it to him, and then, out of respect to his preeminence over other kings, his beard should have the honour of the principal place. But if he refused to do it, he challenged him to a duel with this offer, that the conqueror should have the furs, and also the beard of the vanquished, for a trophy of his victory. In this conflict, therefore, Arthur proved victorious, and took the beard and spoils of the giant, and, as he said before, had met with none that could be compared to him for strength till his last engagement. After this victory, they returned at the second watch of the night to the camp with the head, to see which there was a great concourse of people, all extolling this wonderful exploit of Arthur, by which he had freed the country from a most destructive and voracious monster. But Hurl, in great grief for the loss of his niece, commanded a mausoleum to be built over her body in the mountain where she was buried, which, taking the damsel's name, is called Helena's tomb to this day. Chapter 4. Arthur's ambassadors to Lucius Tiberius deliver Petronius Cotta, whom they took prisoner, to Arthur. As soon as all the forces were arrived which Arthur expected, he marched from thence to Augustodunum, where he supposed the general was. But when he came to the river Alba, he had intelligence brought him of his having encamped not far off, and that he was come with so vast an army that he would not be able to withstand it. However, this did not deter him from pursuing his enterprise, but he pitched his camp upon the bank of the river to facilitate the bringing up of his forces and to secure his retreat if there should be occasion, and sent Boso, the consul of Oxford, and Guarinus Carnatensis, with his nephew Walgan, to Lucius Tiberius, requiring him either to retire from the coasts of Gaul or come the next day, that they might try their right to that country with their swords. The retinue of young courtiers that attended Walgan, highly rejoicing at this opportunity, were urgent with him to find some occasion for a quarrel in the commander's camp, that so they might engage the Romans. Accordingly, they went to Lucius and commanded him to retire out of Gaul or hazard a battle the next day. But while he was answering them that he was not come to retire, but to govern the country, there was present Caius Quintilianus, his nephew, who said that the Britons were better at boasting and threatening than they were at fighting. Walgan immediately took fire at this and ran upon him with his drawn sword, wherewith he cut off his head, and then retreated speedily with his companions to their horses. The Romans, both horse and foot, pursued to revenge the loss of their countrymen upon the ambassadors, who fled with great precipitation. But Guarinus Carnatensis, just as one of them was come up to him, rallied on a sudden, and with his lance struck at once through his armour and the very middle of his body, and laid him prostrate on the ground. The sight of this noble exploit raised the emulation of Boso of Oxford, who, wheeling about with his horse, struck his lance into the throat of the first man he met with, and dismounted him, mortally wounded. In the meantime, Marcellus Mutius, with great eagerness to revenge Quintilian's death, was just upon the back of Walgan, and laid hold of him, which the other quickly obliged him to quit by cleaving both his helmet and head to the breast with his sword. He also bade him, when he arrived at the infernal regions, tell the man he had killed in the camp that in this manner the Britons showed their boasting and threatening. Then, having reassembled his men, he encouraged them to dispatch every one his pursuer in the same manner as he had done, which accordingly they did not fail to accomplish. Notwithstanding, the Romans continued their pursuit with lances and swords, wherewith they annoyed the others, though without slaughter or taking any prisoners. But as they came near a certain wood, a party of 6,000 Britons, who, seeing the flight of the consuls, had hid themselves to be in readiness for their assistance, sallied forth, and putting spurs to their horses, rent the air with their loud shouts, and being well fenced with their shields, assaulted the Romans suddenly and forced them to fly. And now it was the Britons' turn to pursue, which they did with better success, for they dismounted, killed, or took several of the enemy. Petreius, the senator, upon this news, hastened to the assistance of his countrymen with 10,000 men, and compelled the Britons to retreat to the wood from whence they had sallied forth, though not without loss of his own men. for the Britons, being well acquainted with the ground, in their flight killed a great number of their pursuers. The Britons thus giving ground, Hyder, with another reinforcement of 5,000 men, advanced with speed to sustain them, so that again they faced those upon whom they had turned their backs, and renewed the assault with great vigour. The Romans also stood their ground, and continued the fight with various success. The great fault of the Britons was, that though they had been very eager to begin the fight, yet when begun they were less careful of the hazard they ran, whereas the Romans were under better discipline, and had the advantage of a prudent commander, Petreius Cotta, to tell them where to advance and where to give ground, and by these means did great injury to the enemy. When Boso observed this, he drew off from the rest a large party of those whom he knew to be the stoutest men, and spoke to them after this manner: "Since we have begun this fight without Arthur's knowledge, we must take care that we be not defeated in the enterprise. For if we should, we shall both very much endanger our men and incur the king's high displeasure. Rouse up your courage and follow me through the Roman squadrons, that with the favour of good fortune we may either kill or take Petreius prisoner." With this they put spurs to their horses, and piercing through the enemy's thickest ranks, reached the place where Petreius was giving his commands. Boso hastily ran in upon him, and grasping him about the neck, fell with him to the ground as he had intended. The Romans hereupon ran to his delivery, as did the Britons to Boso's assistance, which occasioned on both sides great slaughter, noise, and confusion, while one party strove to rescue their leader and the other to keep him prisoner. So that this proved the sharpest part of the whole fight, and wherein their spears, swords, and arrows had the fullest employment. At length the Britons, joining in a close body and sustaining patiently the assaults of the Romans, retired to the main body of their army with Petreius, which they had no sooner done than they again attacked them, being now deprived of their leader, very much weakened, dispirited, and just beginning to flee. They therefore eagerly pursued, beat down, and killed several of them, and as soon as they had plundered them, pursued the rest. But they took the greatest number of them prisoners, being desirous to present them to the king. When they had, at last, sufficiently harassed them, they returned with their plunder and prisoners to the camp, where they gave an account of what had happened, and presented Petreius Cotta with the other prisoners before Arthur, with great joy for the victory. Arthur congratulated them upon it, and promised them advancement to greater honours for behaving themselves so gallantly when he was absent from them. Then he gave his command to some of the men to conduct the prisoners the next day to Paris, and deliver them to be kept in custody there till further orders. The party that were to undertake this charge he ordered to be conducted by Cador, Bedver, and the two consuls Borellus and Ricerius, with their servants, till they should be out of all fear of disturbance from the Romans. Chapter 5. The Romans attack the Britons with a very great force, but are put to flight by them. But the Romans, happening to get intelligence of their design, at the command of their general, chose out 15,000 men, who that night were to get before the others in their march, and rescue their fellow soldiers out of their hands. They were to be commanded by Voltaius Catellus and Quintus Curutius, senators, as also Evander, king of Syria, and Sertorius, king of Libya. Accordingly, they began their march that very night, and possessed themselves of a place convenient for lying in ambuscade, through which they supposed the others would pass. In the morning, the Britons set forward along the same road with their prisoners, and were now approaching the place in perfect ignorance of the cunning stratagem of the enemy. No sooner had they entered it than the Romans, to their great surprise, sprang forth and fell furiously upon them. Notwithstanding, the Britons, at length recovering from their consternation, assembled together and prepared for a bold opposition by appointing a party to guard the prisoners and drawing out the rest in order of battle against the enemy. Rogerius and Bedford had the command of the party that was set over the prisoners, but Cador, Duke of Cornwall, and Borellus headed the others. But all the Romans had made their sally without being placed in any order, and cared not to form themselves, that they might lose no time in the slaughter of the Britons, whom they saw busied in marshalling their troops and preparing only for their defence. By this conduct the Britons were extremely weakened, and would have shamefully lost their prisoners had not good fortune rendered them assistance. For Guitard, commander of the Pictavians, happened to get information of the designed stratagem, and was come up with 3,000 men, by the help of which they at last got the advantage, and paid back the slaughter upon their insolent assailants. Nevertheless, the loss which they sustained at the beginning of this action was very considerable. For they lost Borellus, the famous consul of the Cymbeline, in an encounter with Evander, king of Syria, who struck his lance into his throat, besides 4 noblemen, viz. Herolgas Desperius, Mauritius Cadocunensis, Aliduc of Tintagel, and Hyder, his son, than whom braver men were hardly to be found. But yet neither did this loss dispirit the Britons, but rather made them more resolute to keep the prisoners and kill the enemy. The Romans, now finding themselves unable to maintain the fight any longer, suddenly quitted the field and made towards their camp, but were pursued with slaughter by the Britons, who also took many of them and allowed them no respite till they had killed Voltaeus Catellus and Evander, king of Syria, and wholly dispersed the rest. After which they sent away their former prisoners to Paris, whither they were to conduct them, and returned back with those newly taken to the king, to whom they gave great hopes of a complete conquest of their enemies, since very few of the great number that came against them had met with any success. End of Book 10, Part 1. Book 10, Part 2 of History of the Kings of Britain by Geoffrey of Monmouth, translated by Aaron Thompson and J. A. Giles. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 6. Lucius Tiberius goes to Lengriae. Arthur, designing to vanquish him by a stratagem, possesses himself of the valley of Suesia. These repeated disasters wrought no small disturbance in the mind of Lucius Tiberius, and made him hesitate whether to bring it to a general battle with Arthur, or to retire into Augustodunum, and stay till the Emperor Leo, with his forces, could come to his assistance. At length, giving way to his fears, he entered Lengriae with his army, intending to reach the other city the night following. Arthur, finding this, and being desirous to get before him in his march, left the city on the left hand, and the same night entered a certain valley called Suesia, through which Lucius was to pass. Then he divided his men into several bodies, commanding one legion, over which Morvid, consul of Gloucester, was appointed general, to wait close by, that he might retreat to them if there should be occasion, and from thence rally his broken forces for a second battle. The rest he divided into 7 parts, in each of which he placed 5,555 men, all completely armed. He also appointed different stations to his horse and foot, and gave command that just as the foot should advance to the attack, the horse, keeping close together in their ranks, should at the same moment march up obliquely and endeavour to put the enemy into disorder. The companies of foot were, after the British manner, drawn out into a square, with a right and left wing, under the command of Augustul, King of Albania, and Cador, Duke of Cornwall, the one presiding over the right wing, the other over the left. Over another party were placed the 2 famous consuls, Quirinius Carnitensis and Boso of Richardon, called in the Saxon tongue Oxenford. Over a third were Achilles, king of the Dacians, and Lot, king of the Norwegians. The fourth being commanded by Hurl, Duke of the Armoricans, and Wolgan, the king's nephew. After these were 4 other parties placed in the rear, the first commanded by Caius the sewer and Bedver the butler, the second by Haldin, Duke of the Rutini, and Guitard of the Pictavians, the third by Viginis of Leicester, Jonathal of Dorchester, and Cursulum of Caicester, the fourth by Eugenius of Bath. Behind all these, Arthur, for himself and the legion that was to attend near him, made choice of a place where he set up a golden dragon for a standard, whither the wounded or fatigued might, in case of necessity, retreat as into their camp. The legion that was with him consisted of 6,666 men. Chapter 7. Arthur's exhortation to his soldiers. After he had thus placed them in all their stations, he made the following speech to his soldiers. My brave countrymen, who have made Britain the mistress of 30 kingdoms, I congratulate you upon your late noble exploit, which to me is a proof that your valour is so far from being impaired that it is rather increased. Though you have been 5 years without exercise, wherein the softening pleasures of an easy life had a greater share of your time than the use of arms, yet all this has not made you degenerate from your natural bravery, which you have shown in forcing the Romans to flee. The pride of their leaders has animated them to attempt the invasion of your liberties. They have tried you in battle with numbers superior to yours, and have not been able to stand before you, but have basely withdrawn themselves into that city, from which they are now ready to march out, and to pass through this valley in their way to Augusta Dunum, so that you may have an opportunity of falling upon them unawares like a flock of sheep. Certainly, they expected to find in you the cowardice of the eastern nations, when they thought to make your country tributary, and you their slaves. What? Have they never heard of your wars with the Dacians, Norwegians, and princes of the Gauls, whom you reduced under my power and freed from their shameful yoke? We, then, that have had success in a greater war, need not doubt of it in a less, if we do but endeavour
with the same spirit to vanquish these poltroons. You shall want no rewards of honour, if as faithful soldiers you do but strictly obey my commands. For as soon as we have routed them, we will march straight to Rome and take it, and then all the gold, silver, palaces, towers, towns, cities, and other riches of the vanquished shall be yours." He had hardly done speaking before they all, with one voice, declared that they were ready to suffer death rather than quit the field while he had life. Chapter 8. Lucius Tiberius, discovering Arthur's design, in a speech animates his followers to fight. But Lucius Tiberius, discovering the designs that were formed against him, would not flee, as he had first intended, but taking new courage, resolved to march to the same valley against them, and calling together his principal commanders, spoke to them in these words: "Venerable fathers, to whose empire both the eastern and western kingdoms owe obedience, remember the virtues of your ancestors, who were not afraid to shed their blood when the vanquishing of the enemies of the Commonwealth required it, but to leave an example of their courage and military virtues to their posterity. Behave themselves in all battles with that contempt of death as if God had given them some security against it. By this conduct they often triumphed, and by triumphing escaped death. Such was the reward of their virtue from divine providence, which overrules all events. The increase of the Commonwealth, and of their own valour, was owing to this. And all these virtues that generally adorn the great, as integrity, honour, and munificence, flourishing a long time in them, raised them and their posterity to the empire of the whole world. Let their noble examples animate you. Rouse up the spirit of the ancient Romans, and be not afraid to march out against our enemies that are lying in ambush for us in the valley, but boldly with your swords demand of them your just rights. Do not think that I retired into this city for fear of engaging with them, but I thought that, as their pursuit of us was rash and foolish, so we might hence, on a sudden, intercept them in it, and by dividing their main body make a great slaughter of them. But now, since they have altered the measures which we supposed they had taken, let us also alter ours. Let us go in quest of them, and bravely fall upon them. Or if they shall happen to have the advantage in the beginning of the battle, let us only stand our ground during the fury of their first assault, and the victory will undoubtedly be ours, for in many battles this manner of conduct has been attended with victory." As soon as he had made an end of speaking these and other things, they all declared their assent, promised with an oath to stand by him, and hastened to arm themselves. Which when they had done, they marched out of Lengriae to the valley where Arthur had drawn out his forces in order of battle. Then they also began to marshal their army,
which they divided into 12 companies, and according to the Roman manner of battle, drew out each army into the form of a wedge, consisting of 6,666 men. Each company also had its respective leaders, who were to give direction when to advance, or when to be upon the defensive. One of them was headed by Lucius Catulus the senator, and Alephantinum, king of Spain, another by Hortatius, king of the Parthians, and Marius Lepidus, a senator, a third by Bocchus, king of the Medes, and Caius Metellus, a senator, a fourth by Sertorius, king of Libya, and Quintus Milvius, a senator. These 4 companies were placed in the front of the army. In the rear of these there were 4 others, whereof one was commanded by Cerses, king of the Iturians, another by Pandrasus, king of Egypt, a third by Polytetes, king of Bithynia, a fourth by Teucer, duke of Phrygia, and again, behind all these 4 others, whereof the commanders were Quintus Carutius, a senator, Laelius Hostiensis, Sulpicius Subuculus, and Mauritius Silvanus. As for the general himself, he was sometimes in one place, sometimes another, to encourage and direct as there should be occasion. For a standard, he ordered a golden eagle to be firmly set up in the centre, for his men to repair to whenever they should happen to be separated from their company. Chapter 9. A battle between Arthur and Lucius Tiberius. And now the Britons and Romans stood presenting their arms at each other, when forthwith, at the sound of the trumpets, the company that was headed by the King of Spain and Lucius Catulus boldly rushed forward against that which the King of Scotland and Duke of Cornwall led, but were not able to make the least breach in their firm ranks. So that while these stood their ground, up came Guarinius and Boso with a body of horse upon their full speed, broke through the party that began the assault, and met with another, which the king of the Parthians was leading up against Achilles, king of Dacia. After this first onset, there followed a general engagement of both armies with great violence, and several breaches were made on each side. The shouts, the slaughter, the quantity of blood spilt, and the agonies of the dying made a dreadful scene of horror. At first, the Britons sustained a great loss by having Bedver the butler killed and Caius the sewer mortally wounded. For as Bedver met Bocchus, king of the Medes, he fell dead by a stab of his lance amidst the enemy's troops. And Caius, in endeavouring to revenge his death, was surrounded by the Median troops, and there received a mortal wound. Yet as a brave soldier, he opened himself a way with the wing which he led, killed and dispersed the Medes, and would have made a safe retreat with all his men, had he not met the king of Libya with the forces under him, who put his whole company into disorder, yet not so great but that he was still able to get off with a few, and flee with Bedver's corpse to the Golden Dragon. The Neustrians grievously lamented at the sight of their leader's mangled body, and so did the Andegavians when they beheld their consul wounded. But there was now no room for complaints, for the furious and bloody shocks of both armies made it necessary to provide for their own defence. Therefore Hierolgas, the nephew of Bedver, being extremely enraged at his death, called up to him 300 men, and like a wild boar amongst a pack of dogs, broke through the enemy's ranks with his horse, making towards the place where he had seen the standard of the king of the Medes, little regarding what might befall him if he could but revenge the loss of his uncle. At length he reached the place, killed the king, brought off his body to his companions, and laid it by that of his uncle, where he mangled it in the same manner. Then calling with a loud voice to his countrymen, he animated their troops and vehemently pressed them to exert themselves to the utmost now that their spirits were raised and the enemy disheartened, and especially as they had the advantage of them in being placed in better order, and so might the more grievously annoy them. Encouraged with this exhortation, they began a general assault upon the enemy, which was attended with a terrible slaughter on both sides. For on the part of the Romans, besides many others, fell Alephantinum, king of Spain, Micipsa of Babylon, as also Quintus Milvius and Marius Lepidus, senators. On the part of the Britons, Haldin, king of the Rutini, Leodegarius of Bologna, and 3 consuls of Britain, Cursulum of Caecester, Galluc of Salisbury, and Urbgenius of Bath. So that the troops which they commanded, being extremely weakened, returned till they came to the army of the Armorican Britons, commanded by Hurl and Walgan. But these, being inflamed at the retreat of their friends, encouraged them to stand their ground, and caused them, with the help of their own forces, to put the pursuers to flight. While they continued this pursuit, they beat down and killed several of them, and gave them no respite till they came to the general's troop, who, seeing the distress of his companions, hastened to their assistance. Chapter 10. Hurl and Walgan signalized their valour in the fight. And now in this latter encounter the Britons were worsted with the loss of Cymarcoch, consul of Trigeria, and 2,000 with him, besides 3 famous noblemen, Richomarcus, Blocovius, and Dragivius of Bodlone, who, had they but enjoyed the dignity of princes, would have been celebrated for their valour through all succeeding ages. For during this assault which they made in conjunction with Hurl and Walgan, there was not an enemy within their reach that could escape the fury of their sword or lance. But upon their falling in among Lucius's party, they were surrounded by them, and suffered the same fate with the consul and other men. The loss of these men made those matchless heroes, Hurl and Walgan, much more eager to assault the general's ranks, and to try on all sides where to make the greatest impression. But Walgan, whose valour was never to be foiled, endeavoured to gain access to Lucius himself, that he might encounter him, and with this view beat down and killed all that stood in his way. And Hurl, not inferior to him, did no less service in another part, by spiriting up his men, and giving and receiving blows among the enemy with the same undaunted courage. It was hard to determine which of them was the stoutest soldier. Chapter 11. Lucius Tiberius being killed, the Britons obtained the victory. But Walgan, by forcing his way through the enemy's troops, as we have said before, found at last what he had wished for, access to the general, and immediately encountered him. Lucius, being then in the flower of his youth, and a person of great courage and vigour, desired nothing more than to engage with such a one as might put his strength into its full trial. Putting himself, therefore, into a posture of defence, he received Walgan with joy, and was not a little proud to try his courage with one of whom he had heard such great things. The fight continued between them a long time, with great force of blows, and no less dexterity in warding them off, each being resolved upon the other's destruction. During this sharp conflict between them, the Romans, on a sudden, recovering their courage, made an assault upon the Armoricans, and having relieved their general, repulsed Hurl and Walgan with their troops, till they found themselves unawares met by Arthur and the forces under him. For he, hearing of the slaughter that was little before made of his men, had speedily advanced with his legion, and drawing out his caliburn, spoke to them with a loud voice after this manner: "What are you doing, soldiers? Will you suffer these effeminate wretches to escape? Let not one of them get off alive. Remember the force of your arms that have reduced 30 kingdoms under my subjection. Remember your ancestors, whom the Romans, when at the height of their powers, made tributary. Remember your liberties, which these pitiful fellows that are much your inferiors attempt to deprive you of. Let none escape alive. What are you doing?" With these expostulations, he rushed upon the enemy, made terrible havoc among them, and not a man did he meet, but at one blow he laid either him or his horse dead upon the ground. They, therefore, in astonishment, fled from him, as a flock of sheep from a fierce lion, whom raging hunger provokes to devour whatever happens to come near him. Their arms were no manner of protection to them against the force which this valiant prince wielded his caliburn. 2 kings, Sertorius of Libya and Polytetes of Bithynia, unfortunately felt its fury and had their heads cut off by it. The Britons, when they saw their king performing such wonders, took courage again. With one consent, they assaulted the Romans, kept close together in their ranks, and while they assailed the foot in one part, endeavoured to beat down and pierce through the horse in another. Notwithstanding, the Romans made a brave defence, and at the instigation of Lucius laboured to pay back their slaughter upon the Britons. The eagerness and force that were now shown on both sides were as great as if it were the beginning of the battle. Arthur continued to do great execution with his own hand, and encouraged the Britons to maintain the fight, as Lucius Tiberius did the Romans, and made them perform many memorable exploits. He himself, in the meantime, was very active in going from place to place, and suffered none to escape with life that happened to come within the reach of his sword or lance. The slaughter that was now made on both sides was very dreadful, and the turns of fortune various, sometimes the Britons prevailing, sometimes the Romans. At last, while this sharp dispute continued, Morvid, consul of Gloucester, with his legion, which, as we have said before, was placed between the hills, came up with great speed upon the rear of the enemy, and to their great surprise assaulted, broke through, and dispersed them with great slaughter. This last and decisive blow proved fatal to many thousands of Romans, and even to the general Lucius himself, who was killed among the crowds by a lance by an unknown hand. But the Britons, by long maintaining the fight, at last with great difficulty gained the victory. Chapter 12. Part of the Romans flee. The rest, of their own accord, surrender themselves as slaves. The Romans, being now, therefore, dispersed, betake themselves through fear, some to the byways and woods, some to the cities and towns, and all other places where they could be most safe, but were either killed or taken and plundered by the Britons who pursued, so that great part of them voluntarily and shamefully held forth their hands to receive their chains in order to prolong for a while a wretched life. In all which the justice of divine providence was very visible, considering how unjustly the ancestors of the Britons were formerly invaded and harassed by those of the Romans, and that these stood only in defence of that liberty which the others would have deprived them of, and refused the tribute which the others had no right to demand. Chapter 13. The bodies of the slain are decently buried, each in their respective countries. Arthur, after he had completed his victory, gave orders for separating the bodies of his nobility from those of the enemy, and preparing a pompous funeral for them, and that, when ready, they should be carried to the abbeys of their respective countries, there to be honourably buried. But Bedford the butler was, with great lamentation of the Neustrians, carried to his own city, Bejokai, which Bedford the First, his great-grandfather, had built. There he was, with great solemnity, laid close by the wall, in a burying place on the south side of the city. But Tudor was carried, grievously wounded, to Camus, a town which he had himself built, where in a short time he died of his wounds, and was buried, as became a Duke of Andegavia, in a convent of hermits, which was in a wood not far from the town. Also, Haldin, Duke of the Rutini, was carried to Flanders, and buried in his own city, Terivana. The other consuls and noblemen were conveyed to the neighbouring abbeys, according to Arthur's orders. Out of his great clemency, also, he ordered the country people to take care of the burial of the enemy, and to carry the body of Lucius to the Senate, and tell them that this was the only tribute which Britain ought to pay them. After this, he stayed in those parts till the next winter was over, and employed his time in reducing the cities of the Allobroge. But at the beginning of the following summer, as he was on his march towards Rome, and was beginning to pass the Alps, he had news brought him that his nephew Mordred, to whose care he had entrusted Britain, had, by tyrannical and treasonable practices, set the crown upon his own head, and that Queen Guanhumara, in violation of her first marriage, had wickedly married him. End of Book 10, Part 2. Book 11 of History of the Kings of Britain by Geoffrey of Monmouth. Translated by Aaron Thompson and J. A. Giles. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 1. Mordred makes a great slaughter of Arthur's men, but is beaten, and flees to Winchester. Of the matter now to be treated of, most noble consul, Geoffrey of Monmouth shall be silent, but will, nevertheless, though in a mean style, briefly relate what he found in the British book above mentioned, and heard from that most learned historian, Walter, Archdeacon of Oxford, concerning the wars which this renowned king, upon his return to Britain after this victory, waged against his nephew. As soon, therefore, as the report of this flagrant wickedness reached him, he immediately desisted from his enterprise against Leo, king of the Romans, and having sent away Hurl, Duke of the Armoricans, with the army of Gaul, to restore peace in those parts, returned back with speed to Britain, attended only by the kings of the islands and their armies. But the wicked traitor Mordred had sent Cheldric, the Saxon leader, into Germany, there to raise all the forces he could find, and return with all speed, and in consideration of this service had promised him all that part of the island which reaches from the Humber to Scotland, and whatever Hengist and Horsus had possessed of Kent in the time of Vortigern, so that he, in obedience to his commands, had arrived with 800 ships
filled with pagan soldiers, and had entered into covenant to obey the traitor as his sovereign, who had also drawn to his assistance the Scots, Picts, Irish, and all others whom he knew to be enemies to his uncle. His whole army, taking pagans and Christians together, amounted to 80,000 men, with the help of whom he met Arthur just after his landing at the port of Rotupi, and, joining battle with him, made a very great slaughter of his men. For the same day fell Orgusel, king of Albania, and Walgan, the king's nephew, with innumerable others. Orgusel was succeeded in his kingdom by Aventus, his brother Urien's son, who afterwards performed many famous exploits in those wars. After they had, at last, with much difficulty, got ashore, they paid back the slaughter and put Mordred and his army to flight. For by long practice in war, they had learnt an excellent way of ordering their forces, which was so managed that while their foot were employed either in an assault or upon the defensive, the horse would come in at full speed obliquely, break through the enemy's ranks, and so force them to flee. Nevertheless, this perjured usurper got his forces together again, and the night following entered Winchester. As soon as Queen Guanhumara heard this, she immediately, despairing of success, fled from York to the City of Legions, where she resolved to lead a chaste life among the nuns in the Church of Julius the Martyr, and enter herself as one of their order. Chapter 2. Mordred, after being twice besieged and routed, is killed. Arthur, being wounded, gives up the kingdom to Constantine. But Arthur, whose anger was now much more inflamed upon the loss of so many hundreds of his fellow soldiers, after he had buried his slain, went on the third day to the city, and there besieged the traitor, who, notwithstanding, was unwilling to desist from his enterprise, but used all methods to encourage his adherents, and marching out with his troops, prepared to fight his uncle. In the battle that followed hereupon, great numbers lost their lives on both sides, but at last Mordred's army suffered most, so that he was forced to quit the field shamefully. From hence he made a precipitate flight, and without taking any care for the burial of his slain, marched in haste towards Cornwall. Arthur, being inwardly grieved that he should so often escape, forthwith pursued him into that country as far as the river Cambula, where the other was expecting his coming. And Mordred, as he was the boldest of men, and always the quickest at making an attack, immediately placed his troops in order, resolving either to conquer or die, rather than continue his flight any longer. He had yet remaining with him 60,000 men, out of whom he composed 3 bodies, which contained each of them 6,666 men. But all the rest he joined in one body, and having assigned to each of the other parties their leaders, he took the command of this upon himself. After he had made this disposition of his forces, he endeavoured to animate them, and promised them the estates of their enemies if they came off with victory. Arthur, on the other side, also marshalled his army, which he divided into 9 square companies, with a right and left wing, and having appointed to each of them their commanders, exhorted them to make a total rout of these robbers and perjured villains, who, being brought over into the island from foreign countries at the insistence of the arch-traitor, were attempting to rob them of all their honours. He likewise told them that a mixed army composed of barbarous people of so many different countries, and who were all raw soldiers and inexperienced in war, would never be able to stand against such brave veteran troops as they were, provided they did their duty. After this encouragement given by each general to his fellow soldiers, the battle on a sudden began with great fury, wherein it would be as well grievous as tedious to relate the slaughter, the cruel havoc, and the excess of fury that was to be seen on both sides. In this manner they spent a good part of the day, till Arthur at last made a push with his company, consisting of 6,666 men, against that in which he knew Mordred was, and having opened a way with their swords, they pierced quite through it and made a grievous slaughter. For in this assault fell the wicked traitor himself, and many thousands with him. But notwithstanding the loss of him, the rest did not flee, but running together from all parts of the field, maintained their ground with an undaunted courage. The fight now grew more furious than ever, and proved fatal to almost all the commanders and their forces. For on Mordred's side fell Cheldric, Elasius, Egbricht, and Bunignus, Saxons, Gilpatrick, Gillamore, Gistafel, and Galerius, Irish. Also the Scots and Picts, with almost all their leaders. On Arthur's side, Albricht, king of Norway, Achilles, king of Dacia, Cador Liminic Casabalaun, with many thousands of others as well, Britons as foreigners, that he had brought with him. And even the renowned King Arthur himself was mortally wounded, and being carried thence to the Isle of Avalon to be cured of his wounds, he gave up the crown of Britain to his kinsman Constantine, the son of Cador, Duke of Cornwall, in the 542nd year of our Lord's incarnation. Chapter 3. Constantine meets with disturbances from the Saxons and Mordred's sons. Upon Constantine's advancement to the throne, the Saxons, with the two sons of Mordred, made insurrection against him, though without success. For after many battles they fled, one to London, the other to Winchester, and possessed themselves of those places. Then died St. Daniel, the pious prelate of the church of Bangor, and Theon, Bishop of Gloucester, was elected Archbishop of London. At the same time also died David, the pious Archbishop of Legions, at the city of Menevia, in his own abbey, which he loved above all the other monasteries of his diocese, because St. Patrick, who had prophetically foretold his birth, was the founder of it. For during his residence there among his friars, he was taken with a sudden illness, of which he died, and at the command of Malgo, king of the Venedocians, was buried in that church. He was succeeded in the metropolitan see by Kinnicus, bishop of the church of Lampeton, who was thus promoted to a higher dignity. Chapter 4. Constantine, having murdered the sons of Mordred, is himself killed by Conan. But Constantine pursued the Saxons and reduced them under his yoke. He also took the two sons of Mordred, and one of them, who had fled for sanctuary to the church of Amphibolus in Winchester, he murdered before the altar. The other had hidden himself in a convent of friars at London, but at last was found out by him, brought before the altar, and there put to death. 3 years after this, he himself, by the vengeance of God pursuing him, was killed by Conan, and buried close by Uther Pendragon within the structure of stones which was set up with wonderful art not far from Salisbury, and called in the English tongue Stanheng. Chapter 5. Aurelius Conan reigns after Constantine. After him succeeded Aurelius Conan, his nephew, a youth of wonderful valour, who, as he gained the monarchy of the whole island, would have been worthy of the crown of it, had he not delighted in civil war. He raised disturbances against his uncle, who ought to have reigned after Constantine, and cast him into prison, and then, killing his 2 sons, obtained the kingdom, but died in the 2nd year of his reign. Chapter 6. Wartoporius, being declared king, conquers the Saxons. After Conan succeeded Wartoporius, against whom the Saxons made insurrection, and brought over their countrymen from Germany in a very great fleet. But he gave them battle, and came off with victory, so that he obtained the monarchy of the whole kingdom, and governed the people carefully and peaceably for 4 years. Chapter 7. Malgo, king of Britain, and a most graceful person, addicts himself to sodomy. After him succeeded Malgo, one of the handsomest men in Britain, a great scourge of tyrants, and a man of great strength, extraordinary munificence, and matchless valour, but addicted very much to the detestable vice of sodomy, by which he made himself abominable to God. He also possessed the whole island, to which, after a cruel war, he added the 6 provincial islands, viz. Ireland, Iceland, Gothland, the Orkneys, Norway, and Dacia. Chapter 8. Britain, in the flame of a civil war under King Caratacus, is miserably wasted by the Saxons and Africans. After Malgo succeeded Caratacus, a lover of civil war, and hateful to God and to the Britons. The Saxons, discovering his fickle disposition, went to Ireland for Gormond, king of the Africans, who had arrived there with a very great fleet, and had subdued that country. From thence, at their traitorous instigation, he sailed over into Britain, which the perfidious Saxons in one part, in another the Britons by their continual wars among themselves, were wholly laying waste. Entering therefore into alliance with the Saxons, he made war upon King Caratacus, and after several battles fought, drove him from city to city, till at length he forced him to Cirencester, and there besieged him. Here Isambard, the nephew of Lewis, king of the Franks, came and made a league of amity with him, and out of respect to him renounced the Christian faith, on condition that he would assist him to gain the kingdom of Gaul from his uncle, by whom, he said, he was forcibly and unjustly expelled out of it. At last, after taking and burning the city, he had another fight with Caratacus, and made him flee beyond the Severn into Wales. He then made an utter devastation of the city, set fire to the adjacent cities, and continued these outrages till he had almost burnt up the whole surface of the island from the one sea to the other, so that the tillage was everywhere destroyed, and a general destruction made of the husbandmen and clergy with fire and sword. This terrible calamity caused the rest to flee whithersoever they had any hopes of safety. Chapter 9. The author upbraids the Britons.
Why, foolish nation, oppressed with the weight of your abominable wickedness, why did you, in your insatiable thirst after civil wars, so weaken yourself by domestic confusions, that whereas formerly you brought distant kingdoms under your yoke, now, like a good vineyard degenerated and turned to bitterness, you cannot defend your country, nor wives, nor children, against your enemies? Go on in your civil dissensions, little understanding the saying in the Gospel, every kingdom divided against itself shall be brought to desolation, and a house divided against itself shall fall. Since then your kingdom was divided against itself, since the rage of civil discord and the fumes of envy have darkened your minds, since your pride would not suffer you to pay obedience to one king, you see therefore your country made desolate by impious pagans, and your houses falling one upon another, which shall be the cause of lasting sorrow to your posterity. For the barbarous lionesses shall see their whelps enjoying the towns, cities, and other possessions of your children, from which they shall be miserably expelled, and hardly, if ever, recover their former flourishing state.
Chapter 10. Loegria is again inhabited by the Saxons. The Britons, with their bishops, retire into Cornwall and Wales. But to return to the history, when the inhuman tyrant, with many thousands of his Africans, had made a devastation almost over the whole island, he yielded up the greater part of it, called Loegria, to the Saxons, whose villainy had been the occasion of his arrival. Therefore the remainder of the Britons retired into the western parts of the kingdom, that is, Cornwall and Wales, from whence they continually made frequent and fierce eruptions upon the enemy. The three archbishops, viz., the Archbishop of Legions, Theon of London, and Thaddeosius of York, when they beheld all the churches in their jurisdiction lying level with the ground, fled with all the clergy that remained after so great a destruction to the coverts of the woods in Wales, carrying with them the relics of the saints, for fear the sacred bones of so many holy men of old might be destroyed by the barbarians if they should leave them in that imminent danger, and themselves instantly suffer martyrdom. Many more went over in a great fleet into Armorican Britain, so that the whole church of the two provinces, Loegria and Northumberland, had its convents destroyed. But these things I shall relate elsewhere, when I translate the book concerning their banishment. Chapter 11. The Britons lose their kingdom. For a long time after this, the Britons were dispossessed of the crown of the kingdom and the monarchy of the island, and made no endeavours to recover their ancient dignity. But even that part of the country which yet remained to them, being subject not to one king, but three tyrants, was often wasted by civil wars. But neither did the Saxons yet obtain the crown, but were also subject to three kings, who harassed sometimes one another, sometimes the Britons. Chapter 12. Augustine, being sent by Pope Gregory into Britain, preaches the gospel to the Angles. In the meantime, Augustine was sent by Pope St. Gregory into Britain to preach the word of God to the Angles, who, being blinded with pagan superstition, had entirely extinguished Christianity in that part of the island which they possessed. But among the Britons, the Christian faith still flourished, and never failed among them from the time of Pope Eleutherius, when it was first planted here. But when Augustine came, he found in their province 7 bishoprics and an archbishopric, all filled with the most devout prelates, and a great number of abbeys, by which the flock of Christ was still kept in good order. Among the rest, there was in the city of Bangor a most noble church, in which it is reported that there was so great a number of monks that when the monastery was divided into 7 parts, having each their priors over them, not one of them had less than 300 monks, who all lived by the labour of their own hands. The name of their abbot was Denute, a man admirably skilled in the liberal arts, who, when Augustine required the subjection of the British bishops, would have persuaded them to undertake the work of the gospel with him among the Angles, answered him with several arguments, that they owed no subjection to him, neither would they preach to their enemies, since they had their own archbishop, and because the Saxon nation persisted in depriving them of their country. For this reason, they esteemed them their mortal enemies, reckoned their faith and religion as nothing, and would no more communicate with the Angles than with dogs. Chapter 13. Adelfrid kills a great number of the British monks, but is at last routed by the Britons. Therefore Hadalbert, king of Kent, when he saw that the Britons disdained subjection to Augustine, and despised his preaching, was highly provoked, and stirred up Adelfrid, king of the Northumbrians, and the other petty kings of the Saxons, to raise a great army, and march to the city of Bangor, to destroy the abbot Denute and the rest of the clergy who held them in contempt. At his instigation, therefore, they assembled a prodigious army, and in their march to the province of the Britons came to Leicester, where Brocanale, consul of the city, was awaiting their coming. To the same city were come innumerable monks and hermits from several provinces of the Britons, but especially from the city of Bangor, to pray for the safety of their people. Whereupon Adelfrid, king of the Northumbrians, collecting all his forces, joined battle with Brocanale, who, having a less army to withstand him, at last quitted the city and fled, though not without having made a great slaughter of the enemy. But Adelfrid, when he had taken the city, and understood upon what occasion the monks were come thither, commanded his men to turn their arms first against them, and so 200 of them were honoured with the crown of martyrdom, and admitted into the kingdom of heaven that same day. From thence this Saxon tyrant proceeded on his march to Bangor. But upon the news of his outrageous madness, the leaders of the Britons, viz. Blederick, Duke of Cornwall, Margadud, king of the Domitians, and Cadwan of the Venedocians, came from all parts to meet him, and joining battle with him, wounded him, and forced him to flee, and killed of his army to the number of 10,066 men. On the Briton side fell Blederick, Duke of Cornwall, who was their commander in these wars. End of Book 11. Book 12, Part 1 of History of the Kings of Britain by Geoffrey of Monmouth. Translated by Aaron Thompson and J. A. Giles.
This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 1. Cadwallo acquires by treaty all Britain on this side of the Humber, and Aedlfrid the rest. After this, all the princes of the Britons met together at Leicester, and consented to make Cadwallo their king, that under his command they might pursue Aedlfrid beyond the Humber. Accordingly, as soon as he was crowned, they flocked together from all parts, and passed the Humber, of which, when Aedlfrid received intelligence, he entered into a confederacy with all the Saxon kings, and went to meet Cadwallo. At last, as they were forming their troops for a battle, their friends came and made peace between them on these terms, that Cadwallo should enjoy that part of Britain which lies on this side of the Humber, and Aedlfrid that which is beyond it. As soon as they had confirmed this agreement with an oath made to their hostages, there commenced such a friendship between them that they had all things common. In the meantime it happened that Aedlfrid banished his own wife, and married another, and bore so great a hatred to her that was banished, that he would not suffer her to live in the kingdom of Northumberland. Whereupon she, being with child, went to King Cadwallo, that by his mediation she might be restored to her husband. But when Aedlfrid could by no means be brought to consent to it, she continued to live with Cadwallo, till she was delivered of the son which she had conceived. A short time after her delivery, Cadwallo also had a son born to him by the queen, his wife. Then were the two boys brought up together in a manner suitable to their royal birth, one of which was called Cadwallo, the other Edwin. When they were nearly arrived at men's estate, their parents sent them to Solomon, king of the Armorican Britons, that in his court they might learn the discipline of war and other princely qualifications. This prince, therefore, received them graciously, and admitted them to an intimacy with him, so that there was none of their age in the whole court that had a free access, or more familiarly discoursed with the king than they. At last he himself was an eyewitness of their exploits against the enemy, in which they very much signalized their valour. Chapter 2. Cadwallo breaks the covenant he had made with Edwin. In process of time, when their parents were dead, they returned to Britain, where they took upon them the government of the kingdom, and began to form the same friendship as their fathers. 2 years after this, Edwin asked leave of Cadwallo to wear a crown, and to celebrate the same solemnities as had been used of old in Northumberland. And when they had begun a treaty upon this subject by the river Douglas, that the matter might be adjusted according to the advice of their wise counsellors, it happened that Cadwallo was lying on the other side of the river, in the lap of a certain nephew of his, whose name was Brian. While ambassadors were negotiating between them, Brian wept, and shed tears so plentifully that the king's face and beard were wet with them. The king, imagining that it rained, lifted up his face, and seeing the young man in tears, asked him the occasion of such sudden grief. "Good reason," said he, "have I to weep continually, as well as the whole British nation, which has groaned under the oppression of barbarians ever since the time of Malgo, and has not yet got a prince to restore it to its ancient flourishing state. And even the little honour that it had left is lessened by your indulgence, since the Saxons,
who were only strangers and always traitors to our country, must now be permitted to wear the same crown as you do. For when once they shall attain to regal dignity, it will be a great addition to their glory in the country from whence they came, and they will the sooner invite over their countrymen for the utter extirpation of our race. For they have always been accustomed to treachery, and never to keep faith with any, which I think should be a reason for our keeping them under, and not for exalting them. When King Vortigern first retained them in his service, they made a show of living peaceably and fighting for our country, till they had an opportunity of practising their wickedness, and then they returned evil for good, betrayed him, and made a cruel massacre of the people of the kingdom. Afterwards they betrayed Aurelius Ambrosius, to whom, even after the most tremendous oaths of fidelity, at a banquet with him they gave a draught of poison. They also betrayed Arthur, when, setting aside the covenant by which they were bound, they joined with his nephew Mordred, and fought against him. Lastly, they broke faith with King Caraticus, and brought upon him Gormund, king of the Africans, by whose disturbances our people were robbed of their country, and the king disgracefully driven out. Chapter 3. A quarrel between Cadwallo and Edwin. At the mention of these things, Cadwallo repented of entering into this treaty, and sent word to Edwin that he could by no means induce his counsellors to consent to his petition, for they alleged that it was contrary to law and the ancient establishment that an island, which has always had no more than one crown, should now be under subjection to 2 crowned heads. This message incensed Edwin, and made him break off the conference and retire into Northumberland, saying he would be crowned without Cadwallo's leave. When Cadwallo was told this, he declared to him by his ambassadors that he would cut off his crowned head if he presumed to wear a crown within the kingdom of Britain. Chapter 4. Cadwallo is vanquished by Edwin and driven out of the kingdom. This proved the occasion of a war between them, in which, after several engagements between their men, they at last met together themselves beyond the Humber, and had a battle, wherein Cadwallo lost many thousands of his followers, and was put to flight. From hence he marched with precipitation through Albania, and went over to Ireland. But Edwin, after this victory, led his army through the provinces of the Britons, and burning the cities before him, grievously afflicted the citizens and the country people. During this exercise of his cruelty, Cadwallo never ceased endeavouring to return back to his country in a fleet, but without success, because to whatever port he steered, Edwin met him with his forces, and hindered his landing. For there was come to him from Spain a very skilful soothsayer named Peletus, who, by the flight of birds and the courses of the stars, foretold all the disasters that would happen. By these means Edwin, getting knowledge of Cadwallo's return, prepared to meet him, and shattered his ships so that he drowned his men, and beat him off from all his ports. Cadwallo, not knowing what course to take, was almost in despair of ever returning. At last it came into his head to go to Salomon, king of the Armorican Britons, and desire his assistance and advice to enable him to return to his kingdom. And so, as he was steering towards Armorica, a strong tempest rose on a sudden, which dispersed the ships of his companions, and in a short time left no two of them together. The pilot of the king's ship was seized immediately with so great a fear that, quitting the stern, he left the vessel to the disposal of fortune, so that all that night it was tossed up and down in great danger by the raging waves. The next morning they arrived at a certain island called Gynaria, where with great difficulty they got ashore. Cadwallo was forthwith seized with such grief for the loss of his companions that for 3 days and nights together he refused to eat, but lay sick upon his bed. The 4th day he was taken with a very great longing for some venison, and causing Brian to be called, made him acquainted with it. Whereupon Brian took his bow and quiver, and went through the island, that if he could light on any wild beast, he might make booty of it. And when he had walked over the whole island, without finding what he was in quest of, he was extremely concerned that he could not gratify his master's desire, and was afraid his sickness would prove mortal if his longing were not satisfied. He therefore fell upon a new device, and cut a piece of flesh out of his own thigh, which he roasted upon a spit, and carried to the king for venison. The king, thinking it to be real venison, began to eat of it to his great refreshment, admiring the sweetness of it, which he fancied exceeded any flesh he had ever tasted before. At last, when he had fully satisfied his appetite, he became more cheerful, and in 3 days was perfectly well again. Then, the wind standing fair, he got ready his ship, and hoisting sails, they pursued their voyage, and arrived at the city of Cadwallader. From thence they went to King Solomon, by whom they were received kindly and with all suitable respect. And, as soon as he had learned the occasion of their coming, he made them a promise of assistance, and spoke to them as follows. Chapter 5. The speech of Solomon, king of Armorica, to Cadwallo. It is a grief to us, noble youths, that the country of your ancestors is oppressed by a barbarous nation, and that you are ignominiously driven out of it. But since other men are able to defend their kingdoms, it is a wonder your people should lose so fruitful an island, and not be able to withstand the nation of the Angles, whom our countrymen hold in contempt. While the people of this country lived together with yours in Britain, they bore sway over all the provincial kingdoms, and never could be subdued by any nation but the Romans. Neither did the Romans do this by their own power, as I have been lately informed, but by a dissension among the nobility of the island. And even the Romans, though they held it under their subjection for a time, yet upon the loss and slaughter of their rulers were driven out with disgrace. But after the Britons came into this province, under the conduct of Maximian and Conan, those that remained never had the happiness afterwards of holding an uninterrupted possession of the crown. For though many of their princes maintained the ancient dignity of their ancestors, yet their weak heirs that succeeded, though more in number, entirely lost it upon the invasion of their enemies. Therefore I am grieved for the weakness of your people, since we are of the same race with you, and the name Britons is common to you, and to the nation that bravely defends their country, which you see at war with all its neighbours.
Chapter 6. Cadwallo's answer to Salomon. When he had concluded this speech, Cadwallo, who was a little put to the blush, answered him after this manner.
Royal sir, whose descent is from a race of kings, I give you many thanks for your promise of assisting me to recover my kingdom. But what you say is a wonder, that my people have not maintained the dignity of their ancestors since the time that the Britons came to these provinces. I am far from thinking to be such, for the noblest men of the whole kingdom followed those leaders, and there remained only the baser sort to enjoy their honours, who, being raised to a high quality, on a sudden were puffed up above their station, and growing wanton with riches, gave themselves up to commit such fornication as is not so much as named among the Gentiles, and, as Gildas the historian testifies, were not only guilty of this vice, but of all the enormities that are incident to human nature. And what chiefly prevailed, to the entire overthrow of all goodness, was the hatred of truth with its assertors, the love of a lie with the inventors of it, the embracing of evil for good, the veneration of wickedness for grace, the receiving of Satan for an angel of light. Kings were anointed, not for the sake of God, but such as were more cruel than the rest, and were soon after murdered by their anointers, without examination, having chosen others yet more cruel in their room. But if any of them showed any mildness, or seemed a favourer of truth, against him, as the subverter of Britain, were all their malice and their weapons bent. In short, things pleasing to God or displeasing, with them had the same weight, even if the worse were not the weightier. Therefore were all affairs managed contrary to public safety, as if the true physician of all had left them destitute of cure. And thus was everything done without discretion, and that not only by secular men, but by the Lord's flock and its pastors. Therefore, it is not to be wondered that such a degenerate race, so odious to God for their vices, lost a country which they had so heinously corrupted. For God was willing to execute his vengeance upon them by suffering a foreign people to come among them and drive them out of their possessions. Notwithstanding, it would be a worthy act, if God would permit it, to restore our subjects to their ancient dignity, to prevent the reproach that may be thrown upon our race, that we were weak rulers who did not exert ourselves in our own defence. And I do the more freely ask your assistance, as you are of the same blood with us. For the great Malgo, who was the fourth king of Britain after Arthur, had two sons, named Ennianus and Runo. Ennianus begot Belin, Belin Jago, Jago Cadwan, who was my father. Runo, who after his brother's death was driven out by the Saxons, came to this province and bestowed his daughter on Duke Hurl, the son of that great Hurl who shared with Arthur in his conquests. Of her was born Alan, of Alan Hurl your father, who while he lived was a terror to all Gaul. Chapter 7. Brian kills Edwin's magician.
In the meantime, while he was spending the winter with Salomon, they entered into a resolution that Brian would pass over into Britain and take some method to kill Edwin's magician, lest he might, by his usual art, inform him of Cadwallo's coming. And when with this design he had arrived at Hammer's port, he took upon himself the habit of a poor man, and made himself a staff of iron, sharp at the end, with which he might kill the magician if he should happen to meet with him. From thence he went to York, where Edwin then resided, and having entered that city, joined himself to the poor people that waited for alms before the king's gate. But as he was going to and fro, it happened that his sister came out of the hall, with a basin in her hand, to fetch water for the queen. She had been taken by Edwin at the city of Worcester, when, after Cadwallo's flight, he was acting his hostilities upon the provinces of the Britons. As she was therefore passing by Brian, he immediately knew her, and breaking forth into tears, called to her with a low voice, at which the damsel, turning her face, was in doubt at first as to who it might be, but upon a nearer approach discovered it to be her brother, and was near falling into a swoon, for fear that he might, by some unlucky accident, be known and taken by the enemy. She therefore refrained from saluting him, or entering into familiar discourse with him, but told him, as if she was talking upon some other subject, the state of the court, and showed him the magician that he was inquiring for, who was at that very time walking among the poor people, while the alms were being distributed among them. Brian, as soon as he had taken knowledge of the man, ordered his sister to steal out privately from her apartment the night following, and come to him near an old church without the city, where he would conceal himself in expectation of her. Then dismissing her, he thrust himself in among the crowd of poor people, in that part where Peletus was placing them. And the same moment he got access to him, he lifted up his staff, and at once gave him a stab under the breast, which killed him. This done, he threw away his staff, and passed among the rest undistinguished and unsuspected by any of the bystanders, and by good providence got to the place of concealment which he had appointed. His sister, when night came on, endeavoured all she could to get out, but was not able, because Edwin, being terrified at the killing of Peletus, had set a strict watch about the court, who, making a narrow search, refused to let her go out. When Brian found this, he retired from that place and went to Exeter, where he called together the Britons and told them what he had done. Afterwards, having dispatched away messengers to Cadwallo, he fortified that city, and sent word to all the British nobility that they should bravely defend their cities and towns, and joyfully expect Cadwallo's coming to their relief in a short time, with auxiliary forces from Salomon. Upon the spreading of this news over the whole island, Piander, king of the Mercians, with a very great army of Saxons, came to Exeter and besieged Brian. End of Book 12, Part 1. Book 12, Part 2 of History of the Kings of Britain by Geoffrey of Monmouth, translated by Aaron Thompson and J.A. Giles. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain.
Chapter 8. Cadwallo takes Piander and routs his army. In the meantime, Cadwallo arrived with 10,000 men, whom King Solomon had delivered to him, and with them he marched straight to the siege against King Piander. But as he was going, he divided his forces into 4 parts, and then made no delay to advance and join battle with the enemy, wherein Piander was forthwith taken, and his army routed. For, finding no other way for his own safety, he surrendered himself to Cadwallo, and gave hostages, with a promise that he would assist him against the Saxons. Cadwallo, after this success against him, summoned together his nobility, that had been a long time in a decaying state, and marched to Northumberland against Edwin, and made continual devastations in that country. When Edwin was informed of it, he assembled all the petty kings of the Angles, and, meeting the Britons in a field called Heverfeld, presently gave them battle, but was killed, and almost all the people with him, together with Offred his son, and Godbold, king of the Orkneys, who had come to their assistance. Chapter 9. Cadwallo kills Osric and Aidan in fight. Having thus obtained the victory, Cadwallo marched through the provinces of the Angles, and committed such outrages upon the Saxons that he neither spared age nor sex, for his resolution being to extirpate the whole race out of Britain, all that he found he put to extreme tortures. After this, he had a battle with Osric, Edwin's successor, and killed him, together with his 2 nephews, who ought to have reigned after him. He also killed Aidan, king of the Scots, who came to their assistance. Chapter 10. Oswald routs Piander in fight, but is killed by Cadwallo coming in upon him. Their deaths made room for Oswald to succeed to the kingdom of Northumberland, but Cadwallo drove him, with the rest that had given him disturbance, to the very wall which the Emperor Severus had formerly built between Britain and Scotland. Afterwards he sent Piander, king of the Mercians, and the greatest part of his army to the same place to give him battle. But Oswald, as he was besieged one night by Piander, in the place called Heverfeld, that is, the heavenly field, set up there our Lord's cross, and commanded his men to speak with a very loud voice these words: "Let us all kneel down and pray the Almighty, living and true God, to defend us from the proud army of the King of Britain and his wicked leader Piander. For he knows how justly we wage this war for the safety of our people." They all therefore did as he commanded them, and advanced at break of day against the enemy, and by their faith gained the victory. Cadwallo, upon hearing this news, being inflamed with rage, reassembled his army, and went in pursuit of the holy King Oswald. And in a battle which he had with him at a place called Burn, Piander broke in upon him and killed him. Chapter 11. Oswin submits to Cadwallo. Piander desires leave of Cadwallo to make war against him. Oswald, with many thousands of his men being killed, his brother Oswin succeeded him in the kingdom of Northumberland, and by making large presents of gold and silver to Cadwallo, who was now possessed of the government of all Britain, made his peace and submission to him. Upon this,
Alfred, his brother, and Oidwald, his brother's son, began an insurrection. But not being able to hold out against him, they fled to Piander, king of the Mercians, desiring him to assemble his army and pass the Humber with them, that he might deprive Oswin of his kingdom. But Piander, fearing to break the peace which Cadwallo had settled throughout the kingdom of Britain, deferred beginning any disturbance without his leave, till he could some way work him up, either to make war himself upon Oswin, or allow him the liberty of doing it. At a certain Pentecost, therefore, when Cadwallo was celebrating that festival at London, and for the greater solemnity wore the crown of Britain, all the kings of the Angles, excepting only Oswin, being present, as also all the dukes of the Britons, Piander went to the king, and inquired of him the reason why Oswin alone was wanting, when all the princes of the Saxons were present. Cadwallo answered that his sickness was the cause of it, to which the other replied that he had sent over to Germany for more Saxons, to revenge the death of his brother Oswald upon them both. He told him further that he had broken the peace of the kingdom, as being the sole author of the war and dissension among them, since Adelfrid, king of Northumberland, and Oidwald, his brother's son, had been by him harassed with a war and driven out of their own country. He also desired leave either to kill him or to banish him the kingdom. Chapter 12. Cadwallo is advised to suffer Piander to make an insurrection against Oswin. This matter caused the king to enter upon much deliberation, and hold a private consultation with his intimate friends what course to take. Among the rest that offered their proposals, Margadad, king of the Domitians, spoke as follows: "Royal sir, since you have proposed to expel the race of the Angles from the coast of Britain, why do you alter your resolution and suffer them to continue in peace among us? At least you should permit them to fall out among themselves, and let our country owe its deliverance to their own civil broils. No faith is to be kept with one that is treacherous, and is continually laying snares for him to whom he owes fidelity. Such have the Saxons always been to our nation, from the very first time of their coming among us. What faith ought we to keep with them? Let Piander immediately have leave to go against Oswin, that by this civil dissension and destruction of one another, our island may get rid of them." Chapter 13. Piander is killed by Oswin. Cadwallo dies. By these and other words to the same effect, Cadwallo was prevailed upon to grant the permissions desired. And Piander, having assembled a vast army, went to the Humber, and laying waste that country, began a fierce war upon the king. Oswin was at last reduced to such extremity that he was forced to promise him innumerable royal ornaments and other presents more than one would believe, if he would desist from ruining his country and return home without committing any more hostilities. But when the other could by no entreaties be prevailed upon to do it, the king, in hopes of divine assistance, though he had a less army, however, gave him battle near the river Wined, and having killed Piander and 30 other commanders, gained the victory. Piander's son Wulfred, by a grant from Cadwallo, succeeded to the kingdom, and joining with Aber and Edbert, 2 leaders of the Mercians, rebelled against Oswin.
but at last, by Cadwallo's command, made peace with him. At last, after 48 years were expired, that most noble and potent king of the Britons, Cadwallo, being grown infirm with age and sickness, departed this life upon the 15th of the calends of December. The Britons embalmed his body and placed it with wonderful art in a brazen statue which was cast according to the measure of his stature. This statue they set up with complete armour upon an admirable brazen horse over the western gate of London for a monument of the above-mentioned victory and for a terror to the Saxons. They also built under it a church in honour of St. Martin, in which divine ceremonies are celebrated for him and the others who departed in the faith. Chapter 14. Cadwallader succeeds Cadwallo. He was succeeded in the kingdom by Cadwallader, his son, whom Bede calls the youth Elidwalder. At first, he maintained the government with peace and honour, but after 12 years' enjoyment of the crown, he fell into a fit of sickness, and a civil war broke out among the Britons. His mother was Pianda's sister, by the same father but a different mother, descended from the noble race of the Genuisians. For Cadwallo, after his reconciliation with her brother, made her the partner of his bed, and had Cadwallader by her. Chapter 15. The Britons are compelled, by pestilence and famine, to leave Britain. Cadwallader's lamentation. During his sickness, the Britons, as we have said before, quarrelling among themselves, made a wicked destruction of a rich country. And this again was attended with another misfortune. For this besotted people was punished with a grievous and memorable famine, so that every province was destitute of all sustenance, except what could be taken in hunting. After the famine followed a terrible pestilence, which, in a short time, destroyed such multitudes of people that the living were not sufficient to bury the dead. Those of them that remained, flying to their country in whole troops together, went to the countries beyond the sea, and while they were under sail, they with a mournful howling voice sung, "Thou hast given us, O God, like sheep appointed for meat, and hast scattered us among the heathen." Also Cadwallader himself, in his voyage with his miserable fleet to Armorica, made this addition to the lamentation: "Woe to us sinners, for our grievous impieties, wherewith we have not ceased to provoke God, while we had space for repentance. Therefore the revenge of his power lies heavy upon us, and drives us out of our native soil, which neither the Romans of old, nor the Scots or Picts afterwards, nor yet the treacherous Saxons with all their craft, were able to do. But in vain have we recovered our country so often from them, since it was not the will of God that we should perpetually hold the government of it. He, who is the true judge, when he saw we were by no means to be reclaimed from our wickedness, and that no human power could expel our race, was willing to chastise our folly himself, and has turned his anger against us, by which we are driven out in crowds from our native country. Return, therefore, ye Romans, return, Scots and Picts, return, Ambrons and Saxons. Behold, Britain lies open to you, being by the wrath of God made desolate, which you were never able to do. It is not your valour that expels us, but the power of the Supreme King, whom we have never ceased to provoke. Chapter 16. Cadwallader, with his people, goes to Alan. The Saxons seize all Britain. With these dolorous complaints, he arrived at the Armorican coast, and went with his whole company to King Alan, by whom he was honourably received. So that Britain, being now destitute of its ancient inhabitants, excepting a few in Wales that escaped the general mortality, became a frightful place even to the Britons themselves for 11 years after. Neither was it at the same time more favourable to the Saxons, who died in it without intermission. Notwithstanding the remainder of them, after this raging plague was ceased, according to their old custom, sent word over to their countrymen that the island of Britain was now freed of its native inhabitants, and lay open to them if they would come over and inhabit it. As soon as they had received this information, that odious people, gathering together an innumerable multitude of men and women, arrived in Northumberland, and inhabited the provinces that lay desolate, from Albania to Cornwall. For there was now nobody to hinder them, excepting the poor remains of the Britons, who continued together in the thickets of the woods in Wales. From that time the power of the Britons ceased in the island, and the Angles began their reign. Chapter 17. Cadwallader is, by the voice of an angel, deterred from returning to Britain. After some time, when the people had recovered strength, Cadwallader, being mindful of his kingdom, which was now free from the contagion of the pestilence, desired assistance of Alan towards the recovery of his dominions. The king granted his request, but as he was getting ready a fleet, he was commanded by the loud voice of an angel to desist from his enterprise. For God was not willing that the Britons should reign any longer in the island before the time came of which Merlin prophetically foretold Arthur. It also commanded him to go to Rome, to Pope Sergius, where, after doing penance, he should be enrolled among the saints. It told him withal that the Britons, by the merit of their faith, should again recover the island, when the time decreed for it was come. But this would not be accomplished before they should be possessed of his relics and transport them from Rome into Britain. At the same time also, the relics of the other saints should be found, which had been hidden on account of the invasion of pagans, and then at last would they recover their lost kingdom. When the Holy Prince had received the heavenly message, he went straight to King Alan and gave him an account of what had been told him. Chapter 18. Cadwallader goes to Rome and dies. Then Alan had recourse to several books, as the prophecies of the eagle that prophesied at Shaftesbury, and the verses of Sybil and Merlin, and made diligent search in them to see whether the revelation made to Cadwallader agreed with those written oracles. And when he could find nothing contradictory to it, he admonished Cadwallader to submit to the divine dispensation, and laying aside the thoughts of Britain, perform what the angelical voice had commanded him. But he urged him to send his son Ivor and his nephew Inni over into the island to govern the remainder of the Britons, lest a nation, descended of so ancient a race, should lose their liberty by the incursion of barbarians. Then Cadwallader, renouncing worldly cares for the sake of God and his everlasting kingdom, went to Rome, and was confirmed by Pope Sergius, and being seized with a sudden illness, was, upon the 12th of the calends of May, in the 689th year of our Lord's incarnation, freed from the corruption of the flesh, and admitted into the glories of the heavenly kingdom. Chapter 19. The two Britons, Ivor and Inni, in vain attack the nation of the Angles. Athelstan, the first king of the Angles. As soon as Ivor and Inni had got together their ships, they, with all the forces they could raise, arrived in the island, and for 49 years together fiercely attacked the nation of the Angles, but to little purpose. For the above-mentioned morality and famine, together with the inveterate spirit of faction that was among them, had made this proud people so much degenerate that they were not able to gain any advantage of the enemy. And being now overrun with barbarism, they were no longer called Britons, but Gualenses, Welshmen, a word derived either from Guallo their leader, or Gualas their king, or from their barbarism. But the Saxons managed affairs with more prudence, maintained peace and concord among themselves, tilled their grounds, rebuilt their cities and towns, and so throwing off the dominion of the Britons, bore sway over all Loegria under their leader Athelstan, who first wore a crown among them. But the Welshmen, being very much degenerated from the nobility of the Britons, never after recovered the monarchy of the island. On the contrary, by quarrels among themselves and wars with the Saxons, their country was a perpetual scene of misery and slaughter. Chapter 20. Geoffrey of Monmouth's conclusion. But as for the kings that have succeeded among them in Wales since that time, I leave the history of them to Caradoc of Lancavan, my contemporary, as I do also the kings of the Saxons to William of Malmesbury and Henry of Huntingdon. But I advise them to be silent concerning the kings of the Britons, since they have not that book written in the British tongue, which Walter, Archdeacon of Oxford, brought out of Britain, and which, being a true history, published in honour of those princes, I have thus taken care to translate. End of Book 12, Part 2. End of History of the Kings of Britain by Geoffrey of Monmouth, translated by Aaron Thompson and J. A. Giles.